The Nile turned black at exactly the same moment every evening. Not gradually, not softly. One moment the water reflected gold, holding the sun's last light like liquid metal. The next, it was obsidian, dark enough that you couldn't see your own reflection even if you leaned close enough to touch the surface. The ancient Egyptians noticed this. They noticed everything about the transition from day to night, because to them, it wasn't a transition at all. It was death. Ra, the sun god, didn't simply set beyond the western horizon. He died. Every single evening, without exception, the god who gave life to all of Egypt descended into the underworld to fight a battle he might not win. The serpent Apophis waited there in the darkness, coiled and patient, ready to devour the sun and prevent morning from ever coming again. This wasn't poetry to them. It wasn't metaphor. It was cosmology, and it shaped everything about how they understood the hours after sunset. Stand in the desert as the sun drops below the dunes, and you'll feel what they felt. The temperature doesn't ease downward, it collapses. Within minutes, the scorching heat that made limestone walls too hot to touch gives way to cold that reaches through linen and into bone. Shadows don't fade, they stretch, impossibly long, turning familiar streets into alien corridors before darkness swallows them entirely. In those moments, the Egyptians believed the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead grew thin, permeable. The rules that governed daylight no longer applied. The protections that kept chaos at bay weakened with every degree the temperature fell. So they took precautions. They recited prayers. They locked doors. They stayed inside, close to whatever light they could afford to keep burning. And they waited for morning like prisoners waiting for pardon. But not everyone hid. Some people stayed awake through the hours when Ra fought for his life in the underworld. Some had duties that couldn't wait for dawn. Some had secrets that couldn't survive daylight. And some, this is what the records whisper, chose the darkness because of what it offered. Power that only existed when the sun god was dead. Knowledge that could only be obtained when the world of the living and the world of the dead bled into each other. The question isn't why ancient Egyptians feared the night. The question is why some refused to sleep through it. Listen to the desert at night, and you'll understand why the Egyptians believed different spirits inhabited the darkness. During the day, ancient Egyptian cities roared with life. Markets overflowed with vendors shouting prices for grain and fish. Construction sites hammered with the sound of stone being cut and dragged. Children ran through narrow streets. Donkeys brayed. Wheels creaked. The air itself seemed to vibrate with human activity. Then the sun died, and all of that stopped. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. In the absence of human noise, other sounds became unnaturally clear. The bark of jackals echoed from the desert hills, and because jackals were sacred to Anubis, god of the dead, their voices at night felt like messages from the underworld itself. The wind across sand produced a whisper that could be mistaken for voices if you listened too long. Wings of nocturnal birds cut through air with sounds sharp enough to wake sleepers from dreams. But the strangest thing about Egyptian nights was how sound traveled. In the dry desert air, with no daytime chaos to muffle it, a human voice could carry half a mile. Footsteps on stone echoed from street to street. A door opening, a lock sliding into place. Two people speaking in what they thought was privacy, all of it audible to anyone who knew how to listen. This made secrecy difficult. It also made guards effective. A patrol didn't need to see intruders. They could hear someone breathing from 3 houses away. Those who needed to keep secrets learned to choose their locations carefully. Gardens with trees to absorb sound. Riverside locations where the Nile's movement masked conversation. Interior rooms in houses built with thick mud brick walls. The architecture of secrecy became its own kind of knowledge, passed between those who had things to hide. The physical world transformed as completely as the sonic one. The desert that baked limestone during the day became cold enough to see your breath by midnight. People who worked outdoors after dark needed wool blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Braziers burned in wealthy homes, filling rooms with flickering light and smoke. The poor simply endured, huddled together for warmth, waiting for Ra to resurrect himself at dawn. The Egyptians believed night air itself was different from day air. Not metaphorically different, actually different. They thought it carried influences and spirits that daylight burned away. Breathing deeply after sunset meant inhaling something other than what you breathed at noon. Some texts suggest they believed night air could change you from the inside, the way water changes shape depending on its container. And then there was the darkness itself. We think of ancient nights as dark, but we don't truly understand what that meant. No streetlights, no electric glow seeping from windows. Oil lamps were expensive, their light weak and unreliable. Most Egyptians lived in darkness so complete that they couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. The wealthy could afford enough lamps to turn night into a dim approximation of day. Everyone else lived in a world divided absolutely between light and dark, between the hours when Ra lived and the hours when he died. In this cold, dark, dangerous world, certain people stayed awake, not because they wanted to, because they had to. The serpent had a name, Apophis, and every night, without fail, it tried to kill the sun. This wasn't a story the Egyptians told to explain natural phenomena they didn't understand. They understood perfectly well that the sun moved across the sky in predictable patterns. They had astronomers who could calculate its position with remarkable accuracy. They built temples aligned to capture its light at specific moments of the year. But they also believed deeply, genuinely, without reservation, that Ra's journey through the underworld each night was a battle for existence itself. According to their cosmology, when the sun set, Ra's solar barque descended into the Duat, the underworld, and began a 12-hour voyage through darkness. Each hour presented different dangers, different demons, different tests. But the greatest threat was Apophis, a serpent of chaos so massive that its coils could encircle the world. It waited in the deepest darkness, in the place where the underworld pressed closest to absolute nothingness. And it attacked. The priests performed rituals to help Ra win this battle. They recited spells, made offerings, performed symbolic acts that they believed strengthened the sun god's power. But there was no guarantee of victory. Each night carried the possibility that this time, finally, Apophis would succeed. The sun would be devoured, morning would never come. The world would end not with fire or flood, but with eternal, consuming darkness. This created a baseline anxiety that permeated Egyptian culture. Going to sleep meant trusting that forces beyond your control would preserve the cosmic order long enough for you to wake. Every evening was an act of faith. Every dawn was a relief so profound that the first words many Egyptians spoke upon waking were prayers of gratitude. But Apophis wasn't the only threat the darkness held. The Egyptians catalogued demons the way modern scientists catalog species. They had names, faces, specific behaviors, and hunting patterns. The face behind walked backwards and attacked from directions you weren't watching. The bone breaker targeted the injured and infirm. The shadow drinker consumed the Kaz, the life force of people who slept without proper protection. These weren't vague folklore monsters. They appeared in medical texts as causes of illness. They were named in protective spells, carved into amulets, that people wore specifically at night. The spells were precise, sometimes listing a dozen demons by name and describing exactly what each one did and how to ward against it. Certain activities were forbidden after dark, and the reasons weren't practical. Yes, it was harder to work without light. Yes, accidents were more likely. But the real reason Egyptians avoided specific tasks after sunset was supernatural. They believed certain actions attracted demonic attention the way blood attracts sharks, loud noises, strong emotions, sexual activity outside of marriage, even speaking the names of the dead without proper ritual precautions. The wealthy protected themselves with layers of defense, amulets blessed by priests, walls inscribed with protective texts, servants whose job was to stay awake and watch. The poor made do with whatever charms they could afford and prayers they could remember. Even pharaohs took the threat seriously. Royal temples performed elaborate nighttime rituals specifically designed to ensure morning would arrive. These weren't symbolic gestures or public theatre. They were conducted in sealed chambers where no common person could observe, performed by high priests who genuinely believed they were holding back chaos. The psychological weight of this belief system is hard to overstate. Imagine living in a world where every sunset might be permanent, where darkness didn't just hide dangers but spawned them, where the boundary between life and death weakened with every hour the sun remained dead. Knowing all this, knowing the darkness held demons, that chaos stalked the night, that even the sun god himself was in mortal danger, who would choose to stay awake? The first answer: those who had no choice. Those whose duty required them to stand between the sleeping world and everything that hunted in the dark. The guards stationed outside the pharaoh's bedchamber stood in darkness so complete he couldn't see the spear in his own hands. He could feel it. He knew its weight, its balance, the way the wooden shaft had been worn smooth by the grip of men who'd held this post before him. But he couldn't see it. He couldn't see much of anything. Oil lamps burned at intervals along the palace corridors, but their light was weak, and the shadows between them stretched long enough to hide entire men. The guards' eyes had adjusted after the first hour, learning to distinguish between grades of darkness, the way daytime eyes distinguished colors. The blackness near the walls was different from the blackness in open spaces. Moonlight, when it came through high windows, changed everything, but not always for the better. Moonlight created shapes that weren't there. It turned familiar architecture into something alien. A limestone column became the silhouette of a man. A hanging textile moved in air currents and looked like someone reaching. The guards learned not to trust their eyes completely. They relied on sound instead. Every palace had a language of night sounds. Whistles with specific pitches and rhythms. Drum patterns that carried through stone corridors. A guard could communicate his status, call for backup, or signal an alarm without speaking a word that might alert an intruder. The signals were precise enough to convey location and threat type. 2 short whistles followed by a long one meant movement in the eastern garden. 3 drum beats with a pause meant possible intruder, human. 4 rapid beats meant animal threat. And there were animal threats. Snakes sought warmth in palace corridors during cold nights. Scorpions hid in shadows near doorways. A guard who didn't watch his footing could die from a sting before his replacement arrived at dawn. They learned to shuffle rather than step, to check the ground with their spear butts before shifting weight, to never sit down no matter how tired they became. The cold made staying alert difficult. Desert nights dropped to temperatures that made men shake despite their training. Guards wrapped themselves in wool cloaks, but the cloaks made movement awkward and muffled the sounds they relied on. It was a choice between warmth and awareness. Most chose awareness. Shift rotations typically ended at midnight or just past. Not because guards needed rest, though they did, but because Egyptians believed the hours between midnight and dawn belonged to forces that physical weapons couldn't fight. The guards stationed during those deepest hours were chosen carefully. They had to be men who'd proven themselves against human threats and who understood the protocols for something else entirely. A particular bird call required a specific response. Not just any night bird, a certain pattern, a certain tone. Strange lights visible in corridors where no lamp burned meant sending for a priest immediately. Wind that came from the wrong direction, that carried a smell like copper or decay, meant evacuating certain areas and sealing doors that were normally left open. This wasn't superstition. It was protocol, written in training manuals, enforced by senior guards who'd served for decades. The guards at Pharaoh's bedchamber weren't just watching for assassins. They were watching for something far harder to fight. But palace guards, at least, knew what they were protecting and why. There were others who stood watch over places where even they didn't fully understand what they were guarding. Places that grew stranger after dark. The men who guarded the Valley of the Kings weren't afraid of thieves. They were afraid of what the thieves might release. There's a misconception about tomb guardians that survives in most historical accounts. We're told they protected royal burials from grave robbers, which is true but incomplete. The full truth is stranger and darker. Tomb guardians protected the living from what rested inside those sealed chambers. From what might emerge if the seals were broken, if the rituals were disrupted, if the careful balance between this world and the next was disturbed. Ancient Egyptians believed the Ka, the life force, the spiritual double of a person, remained tethered to the body after death. It needed the tomb. It needed the offerings. It needed the prayers spoken by priests and the elaborate rituals that sustained its existence in the afterlife. But the car could also move. It could leave the tomb under certain conditions. And at night, when the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead grew thin, those conditions occurred more easily. Tomb guardians walked through necropolises in darkness, patrolling cities of the dead that stretched across desert valleys and hillsides. These weren't peaceful resting places. They were active spiritual locations where hundreds or thousands of cars existed in a state between life and death, maintained by ritual, contained by architecture and magic. The Valley of the Kings held dozens of royal tombs cut deep into rock. The burial grounds outside Memphis sprawled across miles of desert, containing mastabas and pyramids from dynasties stretching back millennia. The rock-cut tombs of Aswan honeycombed entire cliffs, creating a vertical city of the dead overlooking the Nile. Walking through these places after sunset required specific knowledge and particular courage. The Guardians reported phenomena that appeared in their duty logs and in testimony given during investigations of tomb robberies. Lights visible inside sealed tombs where no lamp could burn. Sounds, voices, movement, breathing coming from chambers that had been closed for centuries. The sensation of being watched from doorways that faced only darkness. Cold spots in desert air that should have been uniformly temperature. The feeling of pressure as if the air itself had weight and intention. Whether these experiences were psychological, the product of fear and isolation in darkness, or whether they were natural phenomena misinterpreted through cultural belief, or whether they were something else entirely, we cannot know. The Guardians themselves had no doubt. They believed the dead were active at night. They took precautions accordingly. Every tomb guardian wore protective amulets blessed by priests. They recited specific prayers before entering certain areas of the necropolis. They learned which paths were safe to walk and which should be avoided, especially during the hours between midnight and dawn. Some tombs could be approached directly. Others required circuitous routes that avoided coming at them from particular directions. This knowledge was hereditary. Families of tomb guardians passed techniques from fathers to sons across generations. Some families claimed secret methods for safely approaching tombs that other guardians feared. Whether these methods involved specific prayers, particular amulets, or something else, they kept such knowledge carefully guarded. A family's reputation and their livelihood depended on their ability to patrol areas others couldn't. The tomb guardians didn't fear grave robbers. They feared what would happen if the robbers succeeded in opening certain doors. If tomb guardians protected the boundary between the living and the dead, there were others who deliberately crossed it. Others who not only stayed awake at night but performed rituals specifically designed to communicate with the other side. Thebes after dark was a different city. The grand temples that dominated daylight, Karnak with its forest of columns, Luxor with its processional avenue became hulking shadows. The streets that teemed with merchants and craftsmen during the day emptied into silence. But they didn't empty completely. Night patrols moved through the city in teams of 3 to 5 men. They walked designated routes that changed nightly to prevent predictability, checking doors on houses and workshops, watching for the orange glow that meant fire had started somewhere in the maze of mud brick buildings. Fire was a constant terror in Egyptian cities. A single flame could consume entire neighborhoods before anyone organized a response. But fire wasn't their only concern. Ancient Egyptian cities operated under informal curfews. There were no laws explicitly forbidding people from being outside after dark, but there were powerful social expectations. Respectable people were home. Anyone found wandering the streets late at night was automatically suspicious. The patrols had authority to stop them, demand explanations, and detain anyone whose answers didn't satisfy. They could do more than detain. They could interrogate. They could beat people they deemed threats to public order. The records show they exercised this authority frequently. The challenge was the architecture itself. Egyptian cities weren't planned with straight roads and clear sightlines. They grew organically over centuries, creating networks of narrow streets that twisted between buildings, dark alleyways that dead-ended unexpectedly, courtyards accessible only through passages so tight that 2 men couldn't walk abreast. Patrolmen learned their routes through repetition, developing mental maps of their districts that allowed them to navigate in near-total darkness. They carried torches or oil lamps, making themselves visible from blocks away. This wasn't a tactical mistake. They weren't trying to catch criminals by stealth. They were creating a visible presence that deterred crime through the simple fact of being seen. The light announced, "Authority is here, watching, ready to respond." Most of what they dealt with was mundane, domestic disputes that spilled into the streets, men who'd drunk too much beer and couldn't find their way home, opportunistic thieves testing doors and windows, arguments over debts or boundaries that escalated after dark when anger had all night to simmer. But the patrol records that survived contain other entries. Incidents that didn't fit comfortable categories. People found in places they couldn't explain being. Individuals acting erratically, claiming to have seen things that weren't there or possibly were. Sounds reported by multiple witnesses that had no visible source. Doors found open that multiple people swore had been locked. The night patrols kept records. Most entries were routine, but some entries were marked with a symbol that meant unexplained. The patrols walked the streets, the guards watched the palaces, the tomb keepers protected the dead. But there were places where even they would not go. Places where the only people allowed after dark wore white linen and carried secrets older than the pyramids themselves. The Medjay came from Nubia, from the lands south of Egypt, where the desert met different rules and the night belonged to those who understood its language. They became Egypt's elite police force not through political maneuvering but through demonstrated competence in skills most Egyptians never mastered. Chief among these was the ability to track men through the desert in complete darkness. They could follow a trail 50 miles across sand and stone without losing it. They could do this at night, when most people couldn't see 10 feet in front of them, when the temperature dropped so low that breath became visible mist. No one asked how they did it. No one wanted to know. Part of it was navigation. The Medjay read stars the way scribes read hieroglyphs. They knew which constellations marked true north, how to calculate direction from the moon's phase and position, how to use the angle of certain stars above the horizon to determine how far they'd traveled. This was knowledge that could be taught, and some Egyptians learned it. But the tracking itself was something else. They could identify footprints in sand by starlight, distinguishing between prints left hours ago and prints left days ago based on factors invisible to untrained eyes. They could smell water from miles away and knew which desert animals drank where, allowing them to predict where fleeing criminals would have to stop. They identified sounds carried on night wind, a camel's complaint, a man's cough, the scrape of metal on stone, and understood what those sounds meant about distance and direction. The Medjay operated differently than city guards or palace sentries. They worked in small teams, sometimes pairs, rarely more than 5 men. They were mobile, carrying minimal supplies, capable of moving fast across terrain that would exhaust soldiers weighed down with armor and equipment. When they pursued someone into the desert, they might be gone for days, following trails that led to remote oases, border outposts, or simply to places where the pursued finally collapsed from exhaustion or thirst. They protected caravans that traveled at night, when desert heat became bearable and stars provided reliable navigation. Night travel was actually more practical for long desert journeys, cooler temperatures, less water consumption, ability to cover distance during hours that would otherwise be spent sleeping. But it required guards who could function in darkness. The Medjay could. They investigated disappearances in border regions where Egypt blurred into wilderness, people who left for the desert and never returned, settlements that reported strange activity in the surrounding darkness, bandits who operated from camps that shifted location constantly. The Medjay worked with informants, people who lived in the liminal spaces between civilization and wilderness. Former criminals who'd traded information for clemency, desert nomads who moved between territories, others whose backgrounds remained deliberately mysterious, who appeared when needed and vanished when their usefulness ended. While guards and patrols protected the physical world, there were others whose vigil was entirely different. Others who stayed awake not to watch for threats from outside, but to maintain rituals that kept the cosmic order intact. They worked in temples where the doors sealed at dusk, and what happened inside those doors was forbidden knowledge. Karnak Temple at sunset was a study in controlled transformation. As Ra's light faded from the sky, Priests moved through the complex performing rituals that had been repeated, without variation, for more than 1,000 years. The public, what little public was ever allowed into temple precincts, had been gone since mid-afternoon. Most priests had departed as well. By the time the sun touched the western horizon, only a select few remained. The rest had been expelled, not because their duties were complete, but because what came next was not for them to witness. The closing ritual began in the outer courtyards and moved inward. Junior priests purified spaces with water from sacred pools, reciting formulas as they sprinkled and swept. They sealed doors between different sections of the temple, each doorway requiring specific words spoken in specific order. The architecture itself had been designed with this nightly closure in mind, dozens of doors and gates that could isolate the innermost chambers from everything outside. Then came the lamps, not a general lighting of available oil lamps, but the careful ignition of precise numbers in precise locations. 3 lamps in one chamber, 7 in another. 12 in the room that housed astronomical instruments. The numbers weren't arbitrary. They corresponded to sacred mathematics, to theological principles about the structure of reality, to the number of hours in the night or the number of gates through the underworld. As the lamps were lit, protective spells were recited. These weren't prayers asking for divine favor. They were formulas believed to have actual power, words that created barriers against chaos and malevolent forces. Priests who spoke these spells had trained for years to pronounce them correctly, to maintain the proper rhythm, to avoid the errors that could render them useless or worse. Most of the temple fell into absolute darkness. The outer courtyards, the hyper-style halls with their forest of columns, the libraries and administrative rooms, all of it became as black as the desert night outside. Only the innermost sanctuary maintained light, and even there, the illumination was minimal, just enough to see by, just enough to perform the necessary work. Because the work was necessary, the statues of gods weren't representations or symbols. Egyptians believed they were actual vessels that the god's Ka could inhabit, and at night, when the god was most present, the statue had to be cared for as if it were a living being. The highest-ranking priests, sometimes only the high priest himself, would approach the sanctuary. They would feed the god by presenting offerings. They would clothe the statue in fresh linen. They would recite the evening prayers that acknowledged the god's power and asked for protection through the dangerous hours ahead. Different temples performed different variations. At temples dedicated to Ra and other sky gods, priests spent hours on rooftops making astronomical observations, tracking stars and planets, recording data that combined science and theology. At temples to Osiris, the rituals focused on death and resurrection, on the nightly journey through the underworld. Temples to Hathor had their own practices, some of which involved music and dance performed in darkness. When the temple doors sealed at sunset, the priests didn't leave the gods alone. They performed rituals so sacred that to speak of them outside the temple walls meant death. The outer doors sealed, the lamps were lit. And then, in the deepest chamber where no natural light had ever reached, the night priests began their most important work. The work that had nothing to do with prayer. It had to do with time itself. On the roof of Karnak Temple, a priest stood with a plumb line suspended between his hands, watching stars move across the night sky. He wasn't praying, he was working. His job title, translated literally, was Our Priest. And his function was to mark time through the 12 hours of night with sufficient precision that other priests could perform rituals at their designated moments. Get the time wrong, and the ritual was invalidated. Get it wrong badly enough, and the cosmic consequences were believed to be severe. Ancient Egyptians divided both day and night into 12 hours, but these weren't the fixed 60-minute hours we use today. Egyptian hours were seasonal, expanding and contracting with the length of daylight. A summer night hour was shorter than a winter night hour. This made timekeeping complex, requiring constant adjustment and recalculation. The hour priests used tools whose names have survived. The merket was an alignment device, essentially a plumb line attached to a wooden handle. The bay was a palm leaf rib with a notched end, used for sighting. Together, These instruments allowed priests to track specific stars as they crossed meridian lines in visible vertical planes running north to south across the sky. The technique required extraordinary precision. The priest would align his merket with a particular star, using the bay to create a sighting line. As the star moved westward with the rotation of the Earth, it would cross the meridian at a predictable time. By tracking multiple stars throughout the night, the priest could mark the passage of hours with reasonable accuracy. But they didn't just watch the stars, they believed the stars were watching back. This wasn't poetic metaphor. Egyptian theology held that stars were divine beings, that celestial movements reflected the will and actions of gods, that the sky was an active realm of power that influenced events on Earth. The hour priests weren't merely recording astronomical data, they were observing divine communications. They worked constantly throughout the night, exposed to cold desert air, maintaining focus through hours of darkness when fatigue could make concentration difficult. They used water clocks as backup vessels with small holes that allowed water to drip at controlled rates, with markings inside to indicate elapsed time. But the stars were more reliable, more sacred, more true. The training was extensive. An hour priest spent years learning to recognize stars by their position and brightness, to predict their movements across seasons, to understand the complex Egyptian calendar with its 12 30-day months plus 5 additional days. They studied star charts that mapped the sky with remarkable accuracy. Some of what we know about Egyptian astronomy comes from tomb ceilings where our priests were buried. These ceilings were decorated with star charts showing constellations, planetary positions, and the Decan's 36 star groups that rose sequentially throughout the year. The charts weren't symbolic art. They were working documents, displays of professional knowledge, maps of the night sky as precise as the technology of the time allowed. The hour priests also recorded anomalies. Comets that appeared without warning, planets in unusual positions that suggested divine disturbance, eclipses, especially lunar eclipses visible through the night, which were interpreted as cosmic battles. Sometimes the stars showed them things that weren't in any chart, and when that happened, the reports went to the highest levels of temple hierarchy. But the hour priests, at least, worked in the open air under the stars. There were others who performed their night duties in sealed chambers deep within the temple, where no one outside their order ever set foot, where the walls themselves were covered in words of power that hurt the eyes to read. Deep within the temple, in a chamber sealed from outside observation, a priest wearing a leopard skin approached a statue with a piece of iron that had fallen from the sky. The opening of the mouth ceremony was performed on mummies before burial and on statues of gods when they were first installed in temples. In some temples, variations of the ritual were repeated nightly, renewing the divine presence that made the statue more than carved stone. The ritual's purpose was transformation. A statue or mummy was incomplete, unable to function in the spiritual realm until its mouth, eyes, ears, and nose had been ritually opened. Only then could it eat the offerings presented to it, see worshippers, hear prayers, smell incense, and speak back to those who called upon it. This wasn't symbolic to the Egyptians. They believed the ritual literally animated the object, creating a conduit through which a ka, whether divine or ancestral, could manifest and interact with the physical world. The ceremony required specific tools, each with ritual significance. The most important was the adze, a woodworking tool with a metal blade set at a right angle to its handle. But this wasn't ordinary bronze or copper. The adze used in opening of the mouth ceremonies was made from meteoric iron metal that had literally fallen from the sky, carried to earth by forces the Egyptians associated with gods and cosmic power. The Sem priest, identifiable by the leopard skin draped across his shoulders, would touch the adze to the statue's mouth, then its eyes, then its ears and nose, reciting specific incantations with each touch. The words had to be exact. The order couldn't vary. Each phrase was believed to have power, to actually create the change it described rather than simply requesting it from a deity. The ritual took hours. Between the touching with tools came offerings of food, bread, beer, meat, vegetables, incense. Each offering was presented with its own formula, its own prayer, its own precise gesture. Fumigation filled the chamber with smoke from frankincense and myrrh, expensive imports from distant lands, their scent so thick it made breathing difficult. This often happened at night, because the liminal time between day and darkness, between the living world and the realm of the dead, was when such transformative magic had its greatest power. Night was already a threshold. The ritual created another threshold within it. A moment when the boundaries between animate and inanimate, between spirit and matter, became permeable enough for something to cross. The psychological reality of performing this ritual must have been intense. Sealed chambers, lamplight creating moving shadows, smoke obscuring vision, the smell of incense and offerings. The weight of responsibility, knowing that if you spoke the wrong word, made the wrong gesture, disrupted the sequence, you might fail to animate the statue, or worse, create an opening for something malevolent to enter. They took a piece of iron that fell from the sky and used it to wake the dead. And the dead, they claimed, spoke back. Records exist of rituals that went wrong. A priest who stammered during a crucial incantation reported that the statue's eyes seemed to move in the lamplight, but not in a way that suggested divine presence, in a way that suggested something else had noticed the error and was watching. Another account describes a ceremony interrupted by a sudden gust of wind in a sealed chamber, extinguishing all the lamps simultaneously. The priests involved refused to speak about what happened in the darkness before they could relight them. Whether these experiences were psychological effects of fear and expectation, whether they were natural phenomena given supernatural interpretation, or whether the priests genuinely encountered something beyond normal explanation, we cannot determine. What matters is that they believed. And they performed these rituals night after night, with absolute conviction that they were creating living connections between worlds. The opening of the mouth was the most visible of the night rituals, but there were others. Others performed in rooms that appear on no temple map. Rooms that were sealed after certain priests entered and weren't opened again until dawn. There were chambers in Egyptian temples that appear on no public plan. Rooms accessible only through hidden passages. Spaces whose walls bore inscriptions that referenced rituals never described in detail, only alluded to with phrases like, "those who have seen the secret things," and "the initiated who know." Egyptian mystery cults existed. We know this not from detailed descriptions, but from absences and fragments. References in texts that stop short of explanation. Archaeological evidence of chambers clearly designed for ritual use, but whose specific purpose remains unclear. Mummies of priests, bearing scars in patterns that suggest initiation marks, deliberate cuts or burns that identified them as members of secret orders. What actually happened in these initiations we mostly don't know. The mysteries of Osiris at Abydos involved nighttime rituals related to death and resurrection. Initiates underwent experiences meant to simulate the journey through the underworld that awaited all souls after death. The few references that survive suggest this wasn't metaphorical. They were subjected to darkness, confinement, sensory experiences designed to feel like dying and being reborn. The mysteries of Isis allegedly revealed secret names of power. Egyptian theology held that knowing the true name of a god or demon gave you power over that entity. The mysteries supposedly taught these names to initiates, along with formulas for using them. Revealing such knowledge to the uninitiated was punishable by death, and the texts are explicit about this. Speak the secrets, and you die. Certain practices at temples to Sekhmet involved altered states of consciousness. Sekhmet was goddess of plague and healing, of destruction and protection, of states that existed between opposites. Evidence suggests her mysteries used techniques to push initiates into liminal psychological spaces. Sensory deprivation, extended fasting, possibly psychoactive substances. The blue lotus and mandrake both grew in Egypt, both had consciousness-altering properties, both appear in ritual contexts. Initiations happened at night when the boundary between worlds was already thin. The darkness itself was part of the experience. Initiates were exposed to frightening stimuli, sounds, images, physical sensations designed to overwhelm normal consciousness and create openings for transformation. Some initiates came out of those night rituals different, changed. Some claimed to have seen the afterlife, and some never came out at all. Whether they died during the rituals, whether they were killed for failing tests or revealing secrets, or whether something else happened to them, the records don't specify. They simply vanish from documentation. One text lists initiates entering a chamber. A later text from the same temple lists members of the order, and certain names are missing. We have evidence of secret religious practices. We have architectural spaces designed for them. We have references to transformative experiences and forbidden knowledge. But the actual content of the mysteries remains what it was always meant to be: mysterious. While mystery cult members underwent secret initiations, there were other priests whose night work was less mysterious but no less important. They maintained the rhythms of worship that had continued unbroken for thousands of years. And their routine held secrets of its own. The gods had to eat. 3 times a day, every day, for 3,000 years, miss a single night's offering, and the cosmic order trembled. This wasn't symbolic nourishment. Egyptian theology held that gods inhabiting statues required actual sustenance, and the priests who served them followed feeding schedules as rigid as any maintained for living royalty. Morning awakening, midday meal, evening meal, and then the bedtime ritual, when the god was prepared for sleep through the dangerous hours of night. The evening offering followed patterns that varied only slightly between temples and across dynasties. Bread, usually several types, from coarse grain loaves to fine white bread made from carefully sifted flour. Beer, the staple drink of Egypt, presented in ceramic vessels. Meat, when available and appropriate to the specific god. Vegetables and fruit arranged in prescribed patterns on offering tables. Each item was placed according to rules that specified position and orientation. The bread to the left, the beer to the right, the incense burning at a specific distance from the statue's face. The priest recited formulas as he presented each element, words that invited the god's ka to consume the spiritual essence of the food. What happened next reveals the practical genius of Egyptian religion. The god consumed the offerings spiritually, their divine essence, their ka, but the physical food remained. That food was then eaten by the priests who had presented it, or redistributed to other temple workers as payment for their service. This created an internal economy of remarkable efficiency. Temples owned vast agricultural estates specifically to produce offering materials. The land fed the gods fed the priests. The priests maintained the rituals that kept the cosmic order intact. Nothing was wasted. The scale required to maintain this system was extraordinary. Major temples like Karnak employed hundreds of priests and workers, all of whom needed to be fed. The offering system accomplished this while simultaneously fulfilling religious obligations. Detailed records were kept. Papyri survive, listing exactly what was offered on specific days, allowing us to reconstruct these practices with unusual precision. Night offerings were typically smaller and simpler than daytime ones. The gods, like humans, ate lighter meals before sleep. But on festival nights, the pattern changed. Certain celebrations required elaborate nighttime presentations, special foods, unusual arrangements. And on some nights, the offerings were different entirely. Priestly duties rotated on complex schedules, ensuring continuous service. Different priests responsible for different offerings, different nights, different gods. The system had operated this way for millennia, surviving invasions, political upheavals, dynastic changes. The offerings continued because the alternative was unthinkable. The priests gave the gods bread and beer. But there were times, specific nights, specific festivals, when the offerings were different, when what the gods demanded was blood, and the temples echoed with screams that worshippers were told not to question. The Egyptian night sky was divided into 36 sections, each ruled by a group of stars called a decan. Each decan governed 10 days of the year: rise, rule, set. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision, year after year, century after century. On paper, the priests tracked these patterns. In whispers, they tracked fate itself. The decan system was the foundation of Egyptian timekeeping, their civil calendar, and their understanding of how cosmic forces influenced human events. It wasn't separate from astronomy, it was astronomy, blended seamlessly with theology and astrology into a unified worldview where the movement of stars both measured time and shaped destiny. Each decan had a name and an associated deity. Nemu, a star group near the celestial equator. Sa, the constellation we call Orion, which Egyptians identified with Osiris himself, the god of death and resurrection, visible in the night sky as a figure striding across the darkness. Sopdet, the star we call Sirius, associated with Isis, Osiris's sister and wife. Sopdet's heliacal rising, its first visible appearance on the eastern horizon just before dawn, after a period of invisibility coincided with the annual flooding of the Nile, the event upon which all Egyptian agriculture and thus all Egyptian civilization depended. This wasn't coincidence the Egyptians had discovered. It was divine synchronization they had observed and documented. The priests who tracked decans worked on temple roofs throughout the night. They used the same sighting instruments the hour priests employed: merket and bay, plumb lines and notched sighting rods, but their purpose was different. Hour priests marked time within a single night. Decan observers tracked patterns across years and decades, creating charts that mapped the slow precession of stars, the gradual shifts in their rising positions. The observations accumulated into knowledge that served multiple purposes. Practical timekeeping, knowing which decan was rising told you what date it was, what season, how many days until the flood or harvest. Agricultural planning, the appearance of certain decans signaled when to plant or when to prepare for inundation. Ritual timing, specific ceremonies had to occur when specific decans ruled, aligning earthly actions with cosmic powers. But there was another dimension. The Egyptians believed that whichever decan ruled at a particular time influenced events during that period. Its associated deity was ascendant. Its particular qualities and characteristics shaped what happened in the world. This made the decan charts tools for divination as much as astronomy. You could look at when someone was born, see which decan ruled those days, and know something about their fate. The knowledge was considered so important that Egyptians took it to their graves. Literally, coffins from certain periods were painted on the inside lid with complete decan charts. The deceased would lie there for eternity with a map of the heavens above them, allowing their car to navigate the afterlife, to know which divine powers were ascendant at any moment in the eternal night of death. The sophistication of this system is difficult to overstate. It required continuous observation across generations. It demanded mathematical precision in calculating the changing positions of star groups. It integrated practical astronomy with theological frameworks into a coherent model of how the universe functioned. But the decans moved in predictable patterns. They rose when expected, set when calculated. There were other lights in the night sky that followed no such rules. Lights that wandered. Lights the Egyptians called the untiring stars and feared. 5 lights moved through the Egyptian night sky in ways that defied the orderly procession of stars. They wandered. They brightened and dimmed without pattern. They stopped, reversed direction, then resumed their forward motion. The Egyptians called them the untiring stars, the ones that know no rest. We call them planets. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the 5 visible to the naked eye, the 5 that ancient astronomers could observe and track. But Egyptian understanding of what these lights actually were remains frustratingly unclear from the fragmentary evidence that survives. Were they gods themselves? Vessels carrying divine influence? Physical manifestations of cosmic powers? The texts don't specify clearly, and different sources suggest different interpretations. What's certain is that Egyptians considered them significant, powerful, and worthy of careful observation. Venus was associated with a deity called the Crosser, a name that likely referred to its apparent crossing of the sun during its transitions between morning star and evening star. Jupiter was connected to Horus, who limits the 2 lands, a title suggesting dominion and boundary. The other planets had associations too, though the evidence is fragmentary and interpretation difficult. Tracking these wandering lights required patience and precision. Unlike the fixed stars and decans that rose predictably each night, planets moved against the background of stars in complex patterns. They appeared in different positions month to month, their brightness varying, their speed changing. The retrograde motion, when a planet appears to stop and move backward before resuming forward motion, must have seemed particularly ominous, a reversal of cosmic order that demanded explanation. Egyptian astronomers created tables documenting planetary positions. Some of the most sophisticated astronomical papyri that survive contain these calculations, showing attempts to find patterns, to predict where planets would appear, to understand the mathematical relationships governing their movements. This was astronomy at its most technical, requiring observation across years or decades to gather enough data for meaningful analysis. But the observations weren't purely academic. Planetary events were omens. When two planets drew close in the night sky, a conjunction priest sent urgent messages to the pharaoh. Some of those messages still exist. They're terrifying in their implications. A conjunction might predict war, famine, the death of a ruler, the rise of chaos. The brighter and closer the planets, the more significant the omen. Special rituals were performed in response to planetary warnings. Offerings to appease the gods whose influences were converging. Protective spells to shield the pharaoh from cosmic threats. Consultations with the highest priests to interpret exactly what the heavens were communicating and what actions should be taken. We don't know how accurate their predictions were. The records that survive are fragmentary, often without clear follow-up documenting whether the feared events actually occurred. What we know is that pharaohs took these warnings seriously enough to alter plans, to perform expensive rituals, to seek counsel from astronomer priests whose observations shaped policy. The priests tracked the wanderers and reported their movements. But there were other sky watchers. Watchers who weren't priests, who didn't work in temples, who kept their observations secret because what they were really studying wasn't the stars, it was the future. The dream books were specific, unnervingly specific, and they came true just often enough to be terrifying. Ancient Egypt had professional dream interpreters who operated outside the formal priesthood, specialists in a particular form of divination that required no temple affiliation, no divine appointment, just knowledge of the symbolic language that connected sleeping visions to waking reality. We have their manuals, papyri that list dreams and their meanings in systematic catalogues, allowing us to see exactly what Egyptians believed their nighttime visions signified. The interpretations weren't vague. They were precise, concrete, and often disturbingly accurate in their psychological insight. Dreaming of your teeth falling out meant relatives would die. Dreaming of climbing a mast meant elevation by the god promotion, advancement, rising status. Dreaming of gazing into a deep well meant imprisonment. Seeing yourself with your face in a mirror meant a new wife. Drinking warm beer meant suffering would come. Looking out a window meant your prayers would be heard. The dream books categorized visions as either good or bad, organized them by theme and symbol, provided interpretations that blended practical observation with theological framework. Some interpretations seem like genuine psychological insight, anxiety, dreams about loss corresponding to fears about family. Others seem arbitrary, based on wordplay or symbolic associations that made sense within Egyptian culture but are opaque to us now. That would affect not one person but entire kingdoms. And the most powerful omens appeared in the darkest hours, in forms that defied natural explanation. But not all dreams were equal. Egyptians believed some came from gods, deliberate communications sent to chosen individuals. Others came from demons, false visions designed to mislead or torment. Determining which was which required skill, experience, and understanding of the dreamer's circumstances. Dream interpreters asked detailed questions. What exactly did you see? What colors appeared? Were there sounds? What were you feeling in the dream? What's happening in your life right now? The interpretation emerged from analyzing the dream in context, matching symbols to meanings, identifying whether the vision carried divine authority or demonic deception. People sought dream interpretation before important decisions. Military commanders consulted interpreters before campaigns. Merchants sought guidance before major ventures. Physicians used dream analysis as diagnostic tool, believing certain dreams revealed underlying illness. The practice involved deliberate techniques for encouraging meaningful dreams. People slept in temples hoping for divine visions, believing proximity to the god increased the chance of communication. They fasted before sleep to purify themselves and make their minds more receptive. They performed rituals, prayers, offerings, incantations designed to invite specific types of dreams. When someone had a significant dream, they would wake themselves immediately and record the details while memory remained fresh. This often meant waking during the night, lighting a lamp, writing, or dictating the vision before sleep erased its specifics. The practice connected directly to Egyptian beliefs about night and consciousness. They believed dreams occurred when the ka temporarily separated from the body, wandering in a realm that was neither fully the world of the living nor fully the afterlife. This liminal space was similar to night itself, threshold territory where normal rules didn't apply, where communication between worlds became possible. Dreams revealed the future for individuals, but there were night watchers searching for omens of a different scale, signs that would affect not one person but entire kingdoms. And the most powerful omens appeared in the darkest hours, in forms that defied natural explanation. When a star grew hair and bled across the sky, the priests knew someone powerful would die within the year. They began making lists of possibilities. The Egyptians had names for these apparitions: fire in the sky, stars with hair, wandering flames. We call them comets and meteors, natural phenomena with scientific explanations. The Egyptians saw them as tears in the cosmic order, visible manifestations of divine anger or warnings of catastrophe to come. Comets were the worst. Unlike meteors that flashed and vanished, comets persisted. They hung in the night sky for weeks or months, growing brighter or dimmer, their tails stretching across the darkness like wounds in the heavens themselves. The appearance of a bright comet was considered an omen of such magnitude that it required immediate response at the highest levels of government and religion. Egyptian astronomers observed and recorded these phenomena with the same precision they applied to stars and planets. Meteors streaking across darkness, fireballs bright enough to cast shadows, possibly auroras during periods of intense solar activity, visible even at Egypt's latitude as strange lights dancing on the northern horizon. And actual comets, several bright enough to be visible to the naked eye, appeared during the 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization. The observations survive in fragmentary form: astronomical diaries that note unusual celestial events, letters between priests and officials discussing what was seen and what it might mean, references in royal annals to the year the fire appeared in the sky, followed by descriptions of war, famine, or the death of a pharaoh. The correlations are striking enough to be unsettling, even accounting for confirmation bias and the tendency of ancient historians to connect celestial events with earthly disasters after the fact. A comet appears. Within months, a ruler dies or a kingdom falls. It happened often enough that the fear was based in observed pattern, not pure superstition. When these demon stars appeared, priests performed counter-rituals, offerings to appease whatever divine force was expressing anger through the heavens. Protective spells designed to deflect the threatened disaster away from Egypt, ideally toward enemy kingdoms. Consultations with the pharaoh about what actions might avert the fate the stars predicted. The tension between observation and interpretation must have been psychologically excruciating. Priests needed to watch the sky carefully, to track the comet's path and brightness, to record accurate data, but every night they spent observing reinforced their knowledge that they were watching an omen of death and destruction. They were documenting evidence of their own potential doom. Certain observations were kept secret from the general population. If a particularly ominous celestial event occurred, only priests and high officials were informed. The reasoning was practical: prevent panic, maintain order. But it also created a class of forbidden knowledge, information too dangerous for common people to possess. The sky watchers searched the heavens for signs of disaster, but there were others whose job was to watch for more immediate threats. Threats that walked on 2 legs, threats that whispered in the dark. Because while priests observed the cosmos, there were people in the streets below engaging in activities that couldn't survive the light of day. The beer was weak, but the information that changed hands was potent enough to topple officials, and sometimes did. Egyptian beer houses stayed open well after sunset, their doorways spilling lamplight into dark streets, voices carrying through the night air. These weren't grand establishments. Most were small structures with a front room opening directly to the street, furnished with simple benches or stools, serving beer from ceramic vessels that had been filled and refilled hundreds of times. The beer itself was thick, grainy, barely alcoholic by modern standards, but it was safer than water, cheaper than wine, and consumed at all levels of Egyptian society. A laborer and a scribe might find themselves sitting side by side in the same beer house, drinking the same brew, separated by status during the day but equals in the evening darkness. Many beer houses were run by women who brewed their own beer, following recipes passed down through families. The quality varied. Some establishments developed reputations for particularly good beer and attracted regular clientele. Others survived on location, positioned near workers' quarters or along routes people walked home after finishing their duties. The beer was weak, but the information that changed hands was potent enough to topple officials, and sometimes did. Egyptian beer houses stayed open well after sunset, their doorways spilling lamplight into dark streets, voices carrying through the night air. These weren't grand establishments. Most were small structures with a front room opening directly to the street, furnished with simple benches or stools, serving beer from ceramic vessels that had been filled and refilled hundreds of times. The beer itself was thick, grainy, barely alcoholic by modern standards, but it was safer than water, cheaper than wine, and consumed at all levels of Egyptian society. A laborer and a scribe might find themselves sitting side by side in the same beer house, drinking the same brew, separated by status during the day but equals in the evening darkness. Many beer houses were run by women who brewed their own beer, following recipes passed down through families. The quality varied. Some establishments developed reputations for particularly good beer and attracted regular clientele. Others survived on location, positioned near workers' quarters or along routes people walked home after finishing their duties. They wrote everything down. But not everyone knew that sometimes they wrote two different versions, one for the official record and one that told the truth. In a society where perhaps 1 in 100 people could read and write, scribes controlled virtually all formal communication and record keeping. They wrote letters between officials. They recorded transactions. They drafted legal documents. They kept administrative records for temples, palaces, and government offices, which meant they knew everything. Every grain shipment, every tax payment, every land transfer, every legal dispute, every message sent between people who couldn't write their own letters. The information flowed through scribes, and they were the only ones who could read it, verify it, or question it. This created power that went far beyond their official status. Scribes formed a distinct social class with their own hierarchies, professional associations, and networks of loyalty that sometimes conflicted with their official duties. A scribe's primary allegiance might be to his superior in the administrative chain, or it might be to other scribes in his professional network, or it might be to whoever paid him best. They worked during the day in offices and archives, conducting official business under supervision. But they also worked at night, when oversight was absent, copying documents that needed duplication, drafting correspondence that had to be ready by morning, engaging in work they couldn't do during regular hours because it required secrecy or because it served purposes other than their official duties. More importantly, scribes met informally after dark to exchange information. In beer houses, in private homes, in quiet corners of temple complexes, they discussed what they'd learned, what documents had passed through their hands, what their observations suggested about political developments or economic trends. They coordinated their knowledge, building a collective understanding that no single scribe could achieve alone. Some of them leveraged this knowledge for personal gain. The evidence survives in legal documents, testimony from trials where scribes were prosecuted for corruption. A scribe in Memphis altered a property record, changing boundary measurements to benefit a buyer who had paid him. Another created a false will, forging the signature of a deceased man to redirect inheritance to someone who wasn't the legitimate heir. Others accepted bribes to misrecord grain deliveries, allowing corrupt officials to skim from shipments while the official record showed full delivery. Tax payments were recorded as lower than actually collected, the difference disappearing into pockets of scribes and the officials they served. The schemes were sophisticated, often requiring coordination between multiple scribes across different administrative levels. When caught, punishments were severe: beatings, loss of position, sometimes execution if the corruption was egregious enough, or if the scribe had made enemies who ensured maximum penalty. But for every scribe caught, how many escaped detection? How many alterations were subtle enough to never be noticed? The official image portrayed scribes as faithful administrators, neutral record keepers who served truth and order. The reality was messier. They were human beings with their own interests, their own loyalties, their own willingness to bend or break rules when the incentive was sufficient. Scribes controlled written information, but there were those who trafficked in information that could never be written down. Information too dangerous to record. Information whispered in darkness and denied in daylight. Part of the plot involved magic. They created wax figures of the pharaoh, inscribed with curses, subjected to rituals designed to weaken or kill him from a distance. This wasn't symbolic. They genuinely believed magical attack could succeed where physical assassination might fail. The rituals were performed at night when such practices were believed to have maximum power. They also worked on more direct methods: bribing palace guards to create gaps in security, identifying loyal servants who could be turned or removed, planning the actual moment of attack, the location, the method. The conspiracy was partially successful. Evidence suggests Ramesses III was indeed killed, though exactly how remains disputed. His mummy shows signs of throat cutting. The timeline of his death aligns with the conspiracy's exposure. Whether he died from magical attack, physical assassination, or natural causes that the conspirators simply took credit for, we cannot definitively determine. What we know with certainty is that the conspirators were caught. The trial documents name them individually: TA and her son, officials who coordinated logistics, military officers who agreed to support the coup, women from the harem who participated in magical rituals or passed information, guards who had been bribed, servants who had been complicit. 47 people in total. Their punishments are specified in the records. Some were executed outright. Others were forced to commit suicide, a mercy of sorts that allowed them to die by their own hand rather than executioner's blade. Some faced mutilation before death. The documents are matter of fact about these details, listing names and fates with bureaucratic precision. Several conspirators were women, revealing that even in Egypt's male-dominated political system, women could wield significant power and participate in the highest stakes political violence. The harem wasn't just a collection of powerless wives, it was a political arena where alliances formed and plots developed. The broader implication is unsettling. This conspiracy was discovered and documented. How many others succeeded? How many pharaohs died from what appeared to be natural causes but was actually murder? How many court intrigues played out in darkness and were never exposed? Palace conspiracies involved dozens of people, careful planning, and magical intervention. But there were other secrets exchanged in darkness. Intimate secrets. Forbidden relationships that could only exist in shadows because daylight would mean scandal, divorce, or death. Part of the plot involved magic. They created wax figures of the pharaoh, inscribed with curses, subjected to rituals designed to weaken or kill him from a distance. This wasn't symbolic. They genuinely believed magical attack could succeed where physical assassination might fail. The rituals were performed at night when such practices were believed to have maximum power. They also worked on more direct methods: bribing palace guards to create gaps in security, identifying loyal servants who could be turned or removed, planning the actual moment of attack, the location, the method. The conspiracy was partially successful. Evidence suggests Ramesses III was indeed killed, though exactly how remains disputed. His mummy shows signs of throat cutting. The timeline of his death aligns with the conspiracy's exposure. Whether he died from magical attack, physical assassination, or natural causes that the conspirators simply took credit for, we cannot definitively determine. What we know with certainty is that the conspirators were caught. The trial documents name them individually, TA and her son, officials who coordinated logistics, military officers who agreed to support the coup, women from the harem who participated in magical rituals or passed information, guards who had been bribed, servants who had been complicit. 47 people in total. Their punishments are specified in the records. Some were executed outright. Others were forced to commit suicide, a mercy of sorts that allowed them to die by their own hand rather than executioner's blade. Some faced mutilation before death. The documents are matter of fact about these details, listing names and fates with bureaucratic precision. Several conspirators were women, revealing that even in Egypt's male-dominated political system, women could wield significant power and participate in the highest stakes political violence. The harem wasn't just a collection of powerless wives, it was a political arena where alliances formed and plots developed. The broader implication is unsettling. This conspiracy was discovered and documented. How many others succeeded? How many pharaohs died from what appeared to be natural causes but was actually murder? How many court intrigues played out in darkness and were never exposed? Palace conspiracies involved dozens of people, careful planning, and magical intervention. But there were other secrets exchanged in darkness. Intimate secrets. Forbidden relationships that could only exist in shadows because daylight would mean scandal, divorce, or death. They met in gardens after the second watch. The letters they exchanged were buried with them. We found them 3,000 years later. Ancient Egyptian attitudes about relationships were more pragmatic than we might expect. Divorce was legal and accessible. Women owned property, controlled their own wealth, could initiate separation. Multiple types of relationship arrangements were recognized and managed through contracts rather than moral condemnation. But adultery was different. It was condemned socially and punishable legally, particularly for women. A wife caught with another man faced divorce, loss of children, social ostracism. A man caught with a married woman faced beatings, financial penalties, sometimes worse if the wronged husband had sufficient influence. The evidence that people engaged in illicit relationships anyway survives in letters and legal documents. A woman writes to her estranged husband, accusing him of maintaining a relationship with another woman, demanding he end it or formalize the separation. A legal papyrus describes a man prosecuted for adultery with a married woman, detailing testimony from witnesses who saw them together, the husband's accusations, the penalties imposed. Same-sex relationships existed. Evidence appears in art, in literary texts, in occasional legal references. Understanding Egyptian attitudes is complicated by cultural differences in how sexuality was conceptualized and categorized. What we can say with confidence is that such relationships occurred, that they're documented, and that Egyptian responses varied depending on social status, specific circumstances, and local attitudes. Night provided cover for relationships that couldn't survive daylight scrutiny. Illicit meetings happened after dark when movements were less visible, when fewer people were watching streets and gardens, when alibis became harder to verify. The same acoustic properties that made secrecy difficult voices carrying far and desert air also made certain locations valuable. Gardens with trees to absorb sound. Riverside areas where the Nile's movement masked conversation. Interior rooms where thick walls provided privacy. Some people worked as go-betweens, arranging meetings, carrying messages, providing alibis. Certain houses developed reputations for discretion, their owners willing to host encounters for payment or favor. Gardens, especially those attached to wealthy estates, became known locations for assignations, their pathways and pavilions offering both privacy and plausible deniability. The letters found in tombs reveal the emotional dimension. Declarations of love written on pottery shards, messages arranging meetings, promises and accusations and desperate pleas. These weren't just transactional arrangements, they involved genuine emotion, desire, attachment, all the complexity of human intimacy. When relationships were discovered, consequences varied. Divorce proceedings that became public spectacles, families destroyed by scandal, reputations ruined. Sometimes, violence legal documents reference wronged husbands attacking lovers, courts deciding whether such violence was justified. Love, at least, carried warmth, even when forbidden. But there were other whispers in the night that carried only coldness. Accusations that could destroy entire families. Words that could reshape official reality itself. The punishment for making a false accusation was the same penalty your victim would have faced, but they had to prove it was false, and that was almost impossible. Egypt's legal system was relatively sophisticated for its time. Courts existed at local and regional levels. Traveling judges heard cases in districts too small for permanent officials. The wealthy could appeal decisions to higher authorities. Written contracts and testimony carried weight. Justice, by ancient standards, was achievable. But the system could be manipulated. Accusations became weapons, deployed strategically to destroy enemies, eliminate rivals, or extract revenge for slights real or imagined. The cases survive in legal papyri, documented with the bureaucratic precision Egyptians applied to everything they recorded. A man accused his brother of stealing their father's inheritance, presenting forged documents that supposedly proved the theft. The brother defended himself, brought witnesses, challenged the document's authenticity. The case dragged through courts for months before the forgery was exposed and the accuser punished. A woman accused her neighbor of practicing harmful magic, claiming the neighbor had created wax figures and performed curses that caused illness in the accuser's family. The accusation was serious. Magical attack was a crime punishable by death. The neighbor denied everything, but proving innocence was difficult. How do you prove you didn't perform secret rituals? The case required expert testimony from priests who examined the accused's home for evidence of magical implements, questioned neighbors about suspicious behavior, and ultimately couldn't find proof. The accused survived, but her reputation was destroyed. Officials accused rivals of corruption or disloyalty, using institutional mechanisms to eliminate competition. An administrator claimed his colleague had been skimming from grain deliveries, presenting records that supposedly documented the theft. The accused couldn't adequately defend against the documentation. His counterclaims looked like desperation. He was removed from position, his property confiscated, his career ended. Night played a crucial role in how accusations spread. They started informally, whispered in evening gatherings at beer houses or private homes. Someone would mention suspicions. Others would add their own observations. The rumors would spread through social networks before any formal complaint was filed. By the time an official accusation was made, the damage was already done. The accused person's reputation had been poisoned. Neighbors viewed them with suspicion. Officials were predisposed to believe the accusations because they'd already heard the rumors. The formal legal process became a confirmation of what everyone supposedly already knew. The legal proceedings themselves could be brutal. Accusations required testimony and evidence, but the standards weren't what modern systems would recognize. Witness testimony was weighted by social status. A noble's word carried more weight than a peasant's. Torture was legal, applied to extract confessions or testimony, making reliability questionable. Judges were local officials who might have personal connections to one party or the other. Someone with the right connections, the right social standing, the right resources could weaponize this system effectively. They could orchestrate accusations, line up witnesses, present documentation that was difficult to challenge. Their victims, especially if they lacked equivalent connections, had limited recourse. Some accusations were made sincerely. People genuinely believed neighbors practiced witchcraft, genuinely thought rivals had stolen from them, genuinely felt wronged by behavior that might or might not have occurred. Distinguishing genuine grievances from malicious fabrications was difficult then and remains difficult now when examining historical records. False accusations were theoretically punishable. If you accused someone and they were found innocent, you could face the same penalty they would have suffered if found guilty. But proving an accusation was false rather than simply unproven required a level of evidence that was rarely achievable. Accusers faced little practical risk. Words could kill in ancient Egypt, but there were those whose words were believed to have literal power, power to heal, to curse, to command spirits. And they worked at night, because darkness amplified their words into something more than human speech. They believed you died every night, just a little. And every morning, you had to be reborn, unless something held you in the darkness. Sleep wasn't rest to ancient Egyptians. It was transformation. When you closed your eyes and consciousness faded, your ka, the life force that animated your body, partially separated and traveled to other realms. You existed in a state between living and dead, between the physical world and the spiritual one. This wasn't metaphor. It was how they understood what happened when awareness dissolved and dreams began. Sleep was a rehearsal for death, a temporary separation that prefigured the permanent one that awaited everyone. The fact that you woke up each morning was a small resurrection, a return of the ka to the body, a renewal of life. The vulnerability of this state required protection. Amulets were placed under pillows or woven into sleeping mats, small carved figures of protective deities like Bez or Tawaret, inscriptions that warded against demons who preyed on the sleeping. Spells were recited before lying down, formulas that created barriers around the sleeper, that asked gods to guard the vulnerable ka during its nocturnal wandering. Sleeping position mattered. Some texts suggest sleeping on the left side was safer than the right, that facing certain directions aligned you with protective cosmic forces, while other orientations left you exposed. These weren't casual preferences, they were protocols based on theological understanding of how spiritual forces operated. Seeing someone asleep was witnessing them in a semi-dead state, vulnerable and powerless. There were restrictions about who could observe you sleeping, parallel to restrictions about who could see you during certain rituals or in states of impurity. Sleep was intimate and dangerous in ways that went beyond physical vulnerability. The physical reality of Egyptian sleeping arrangements reflected both practical needs and spiritual concerns. The wealthy slept on wooden beds raised off the ground, often with headrests, curved wooden supports that kept the head elevated. These weren't comfortable by modern standards, but they served purposes beyond comfort. Elevation helped with the heat. The hard headrest prevented elaborate hairstyles from being ruined, and the positioning had spiritual significance related to how the ka separated from the body. Most Egyptians slept on woven mats or elevated platforms. During the hottest months, people slept outdoors on rooftops or in courtyards, seeking whatever breeze might provide relief. This increased vulnerability to animals, to thieves, to spiritual threats that wandered through darkness. Literature and religious texts depict sleep as a time when demons could attack. The ka, separated from the body, could be harmed by malicious spirits or by magic directed at the sleeper by enemies. Some people feared sleep intensely and tried to stay awake through dangerous hours. Others cultivated specific sleep practices, fasting, ritual purification, prayers hoping to encourage prophetic dreams or divine encounters during their vulnerable state. If sleep was dangerous, dreams were doubly so, because in dreams, the separated ka encountered messages, visions, and entities that could reveal the future or threaten the dreamer's life. Understanding dreams wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Dream book entry number 43. If a man sees himself in a dream uncovering his own backside, bad. It means he will become an orphan. They weren't joking. The Ramesside dream book, written during the 19th dynasty, survives on papyrus that's been handled carefully enough that we can still read its contents 3,000 years later. It contains over 100 dreams with interpretations, organized meticulously into categories labeled good and bad. The entries are specific to the point of being bizarre. If a man sees himself in a dream looking out of a window, good, it means the hearing of his cry by his God. If a man sees himself in a dream with his bed catching fire, bad, it means driving away his wife. If a man sees himself in a dream drinking warm beer, bad, suffering will come to him. If a man sees himself in a dream seeing his face in a mirror, good, it means a new life. The format is consistent. Description of the dream, classification as good or bad, interpretation of what it means. No ambiguity, no hedging, no multiple possible meanings. Each dream corresponds to one specific outcome. Some interpretations used wordplay. Egyptian words that sounded similar created connections between dream images and their meanings. A dream about a certain object might predict an event because the word for that object sounded like the word for the predicted outcome. This linguistic connection made sense within Egyptian language and culture, but becomes opaque when translated, leaving us with interpretations that seem random. Other interpretations reflect what looks like genuine psychological insight. Dreams about teeth falling out connected to fears about family loss, anxiety manifesting as physical disintegration. Dreams about elevation corresponding to aspirations for higher status. These feel familiar, aligned with patterns modern psychology recognizes. But then there are entries that seem completely arbitrary, connections we can't explain, even accounting for cultural differences and lost context. The dream books were copied and recopied across centuries. Multiple versions survive from different time periods, suggesting these texts were valued resources that scribes thought worth preserving and duplicating. Many someones across generations considered this knowledge important enough to maintain. Who wrote the original texts? We don't know. Who used them? That's clearer. Evidence suggests both professional dream interpreters consulted these books and literate individuals referenced them for personal use. The books weren't secret knowledge restricted to priests, but they weren't widely accessible either, since literacy was rare. One detail reveals the complexity of the system. Interpretations varied by social status. The same dream meant different things depending on whether the dreamer was wealthy or poor, official or laborer. A dream about receiving food might predict prosperity for a poor person but illness for a rich one. Context mattered as much as content. The dream books gave standard interpretations, but there were dreams and dreamers that required deeper analysis. Dreams sent directly from gods that couldn't be understood through simple reference books. These required specialists. The dream interpreter told the general his nightmare meant victory. 3 months later, the general was dead, and the interpreter had vanished with a fortune in gold. Dream interpretation was a profession in ancient Egypt, and for some practitioners, it was lucrative. People paid well for accurate interpretations, especially when facing important decisions. A merchant considering a major investment. A couple debating whether to marry. An official uncertain about accepting a position. Someone sick wanting to know if they would recover. All of them sought interpreters who could translate their nighttime visions into actionable guidance. Some interpreters worked through temples, specializing in dreams received by people who slept in sacred precincts, hoping for divine communication. These temple interpreters had official positions, training in religious texts, access to libraries of dream literature. They interpreted dreams as messages from specific gods, analyzing what the deity was communicating and what response was required. Others were independent operators. They set up in markets, offering interpretations for modest fees. They visited wealthy clients at home, conducting private consultations. They built reputations through word of mouth, through successful predictions, through clients who believed their guidance had proven valuable. The methods varied but followed recognizable patterns. A skilled interpreter asked detailed questions. What exactly did you see in the dream? What colors appeared? Were there sounds? How did you feel during the dream and after waking? What's happening in your life right now? What decisions are you facing? What are you afraid of? This was consultation, what we might recognize as therapy. The interpreter gathered information, contextualized the dream within the client's circumstances, and constructed an interpretation that made sense given both the dream content and the life situation. The best interpreters combined knowledge of traditional dream book meanings with psychological insight about the individual client, improvising interpretations that felt both authoritative and personally relevant. There were also charlatans, interpreters who told clients what they wanted to hear regardless of dream content, those who manipulated interpretations to encourage specific actions that benefited the interpreter financially. Those who made deliberately vague predictions that could be interpreted as accurate regardless of outcome. We know of specific cases where dream interpretations influenced major decisions. Military campaigns planned based on commanders' dreams interpreted as divine encouragement. Other campaigns cancelled when dreams predicted disaster. Marriages arranged because dreams suggested compatibility. Business ventures undertaken or abandoned based on interpreted visions. The profession created opportunities for social mobility. Dream interpretation didn't require noble birth or official appointment. It required claimed special insight, ability to convince clients of accuracy, and enough successful predictions to build reputation. Some interpreters became influential advisors to powerful people, gaining access to circles far above their birth status. When predictions failed, interpreters had explanations. The dreamer had misremembered details. The interpretation was correct, but the client had acted incorrectly. The dream was sent by a demon rather than a god, and was designed to mislead. These explanations protected the interpreter's reputation while maintaining the belief system that made their profession viable. Most dreams were personal messages about individual fate. But there were other dreams. Dreams that supposedly predicted the fate of kingdoms. Dreams that pharaohs themselves experienced and feared. They ground the grain at midnight, kneaded dough at 2, and had fresh bread in the streets by dawn. 5 hours of work, repeated every single night, for an entire lifetime. Bread was the foundation of Egyptian life. Not a luxury or supplement, but the staple food that sustained everyone from pharaohs to field workers. And bread required labor that began when most people were sleeping. The process started with grinding grain into flour. This was usually women's work, done with grinding stones, flat base stones, and smaller upper stones that crushed grain through circular motion. The work was exhausting, physically demanding in ways that left permanent marks on skeletons we find thousands of years later. Bent spines, damaged knees, worn joints from hours of repetitive movement. For commercial bakeries producing bread at scale, the grinding began around midnight. The flour had to be ready before dough could be mixed, and dough needed time to rest before shaping and baking. The timeline worked backward from dawn, when fresh bread was expected in markets and delivered to institutions. Bakers, mostly men working in family businesses or in large institutional bakeries connected to temples and palaces, arrived in the deep night to begin mixing and kneading. Large quantities of dough required strength and stamina. The work was done in conditions lit only by oil lamps, their weak flames creating more shadow than illumination, the heat from ovens already being prepared adding to the difficulty. The ovens themselves were clay structures that required hours to reach proper temperature. They had to be fired and maintained carefully, fed with fuel, monitored constantly. The fire hazard was real and constant. Bakery fires were common enough to appear regularly in administrative records documenting property damage and casualties. By the time most people were waking, bakers had already completed a full shift of intense physical labor. The bread was shaped, baked, cooling or still hot from ovens. It would be distributed through markets, delivered to temples for offerings, provided to workers as part of their compensation. Egypt had dozens of bread varieties distinguished by ingredients, shapes, and baking methods. Coarse grain loaves for common consumption. Fine white bread made from carefully sifted flour for the wealthy. Breads shaped into specific forms for ritual purposes. Breads sweetened with honey or dates. Each variety required specific knowledge and technique. Evidence suggests bakeries concentrated in specific neighborhoods, probably due to fire risk. This created communities of night workers who lived and labored together, whose schedules aligned them with darkness rather than daylight, who knew each other's rhythms and shared the particular exhaustion of work that began when everyone else slept. Bakers worked to feed the living. But there were others who worked through the night preparing for the dead. And what they did to bodies in darkness remained secret for thousands of years. They cut open the dead and removed what made them human. They worked in darkness, covered in resins and powders, and believed they were creating eternal life. Mummification occurred largely at night for reasons both practical and profound. Cooler nighttime temperatures slowed decomposition and made the work more bearable for embalmers who spent hours in close contact with corpses. The association between death, transformation, and darkness gave the work ritual significance. The dead were being prepared for their journey through the night realm of the underworld. And there were social considerations. The work was disturbing, the smells overwhelming. Keeping it away from populated areas during the day, when most people were active, reduced the psychological burden on communities. What embalmers did was precise, methodical, and grotesque. They removed the brain through the nose using long bronze hooks, pulling it out in pieces through the nasal cavity. They made an incision in the left side of the abdomen and removed the internal organs, liver, lungs, stomach, intestines. The heart was left in place because it was needed for judgment in the afterlife. Each removed organ was treated separately, preserved, and placed in canopic jars protected by specific deities. The body was then covered in natron, a naturally occurring salt that dried and preserved tissue. It remained buried in natron for 40 days, while the salt absorbed all moisture, transforming flesh into something that could survive millennia. After drying, the body was washed, treated with oils and resins, and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen strips. Amulets were placed between the layers for protection. Prayers were recited at specific stages. This work required specialized knowledge passed from fathers to sons in hereditary professions. Embalmers knew anatomy, preservation, chemistry, ritual procedures. They worked in dedicated buildings called Pernefer House of Beauty, House of Perfection, located away from residential areas, near water sources needed for ritual purification and practical washing. The social status paradox was real. Embalmers performed essential religious work, creating the physical vessel that would carry the deceased into eternity. They were participating in sacred transformation, in the defeat of death itself. But they also handled corpses, making them ritually impure according to Egyptian beliefs about contact with the dead. They occupied a liminal social position, necessary but contaminated, respected but avoided. The working conditions were brutal. The smell of decomposition filled the Pernefer despite incense burned constantly to mask it. The physical demands were exhausting, moving bodies, applying treatments, maintaining positions for hours during wrapping procedures. The psychological effects of spending every working day surrounded by death, of cutting into bodies, of seeing human beings reduced to objects for processing, must have been significant. The work operated on different tiers. Wealthy clients paid for elaborate procedures involving the finest materials, the most skilled embalmers, extensive wrapping and amulet placement. Common people received simpler treatments, basic evisceration, less natron time, minimal wrapping. The poorest received almost nothing, their bodies preserved only by Egypt's dry climate. Embalmers at least knew their work would end at dawn. But there were others whose night work never truly ended, whose labor was so continuous and exhausting that it aged them prematurely and killed them young. The skeletons found in ancient mine shafts show fractured bones, damaged lungs, and signs of starvation. And they belonged to children. Mining was where Egyptian civilization revealed its capacity for organized cruelty. Gold mines in Nubia and the eastern desert operated continuously, with workers laboring in shifts around the clock to extract the metal that funded temples, paid armies, and displayed pharaonic power to the world. Most miners weren't volunteers. They were prisoners of war, convicted criminals, conquered peoples, anyone whose labor could be extracted without political consequence. The conditions were designed for maximum extraction, not survival. The mines were brutally hot even at night, poorly ventilated, prone to cave-ins that buried workers alive. Night shifts were particularly dangerous. Visibility depended on small oil lamps that provided barely enough light to see the rock face. Workers broke stone with hammers in darkness, unable to see structural weaknesses that might collapse, unable to judge whether the tunnel they were extending would hold or fail. The mining process was primitive but effective. Workers used fire-setting techniques, heating rock with fire, then dousing it with water to create thermal shock that cracked the stone. They broke through with stone and bronze tools. They transported ore in baskets, carrying it up through shafts and tunnels, some of which descended hundreds of feet into earth. Archaeological evidence from mining sites tells stories the official records ignore. Workers' camps show cramped conditions, minimal shelter, evidence of malnutrition. Skeletal remains display fractures from cave-ins and falls, lung damage from inhaling dust and smoke, signs of disease and starvation. Some skeletons are small. Children worked in these mines, their size making them useful for accessing narrow passages adults couldn't reach. Some mines operated seasonally, closing during summer months when temperatures made work impossible even for forced labor. Others ran year-round, requiring continuous shifts of workers who were worked until they died and replaced with new prisoners. This was the foundation that supported Egyptian grandeur. The gold that covered temple walls, that adorned pharaohs, that filled tombs, it came from these mines, extracted by people who had no choice and no hope. While some labored under compulsion in darkness underground, others worked in the open air through the night, guided by stars, moving goods across vast distances. The night wasn't their enemy, it was their ally. They navigated by stars across hundreds of miles of desert, missed the water source by 5 miles, and they'd die. Every single one of them knew this. They traveled anyway. Long-distance trade caravans crossed Egypt's deserts largely at night because darkness made the impossible merely difficult. Daytime temperatures could kill men and animals within hours. Night brought cold, but cold was survivable. Heat was not. The caravans consisted of donkeys in earlier periods, camels later as the animals became common in Egypt. Each beast carried goods worth fortunes: gold from Nubian mines, incense from Punt, precious stones from desert quarries, luxury items traveling between cities. Merchants traveled with guards, with guides who knew the routes and water sources, with enough men to handle the animals and defend against threats. Night travel required specific knowledge that separated successful caravans from failed ones. Star navigation wasn't optional, it was survival skill. Guides learned which constellations marked true directions, how to adjust for seasonal variations, how to calculate distance traveled by star positions. They read landscape features in moonlight and starlight, recognizing rock formations and subtle terrain changes invisible to untrained eyes. The stakes were absolute. Desert water sources were spaced at the limits of what loaded animals could travel between. Miss one by even a few miles, and the entire caravan could die of thirst before finding the next. Navigation had to be precise, not approximately, but exactly. Dangers beyond thirst existed. Bandits attacked caravans, though night actually reduced this risk. Bandits had the same visibility limitations as their targets. Sandstorms could disorient even experienced guides. Animals could scatter if startled by predators. Equipment could fail. A broken water container meant death. The rhythm of caravan travel alternated movement with rest. Travel during coolest hours, late night, early morning. Rest during midday heat. Move again in evening. The pattern maximized distance while minimizing heat exposure. Evidence of these routes survives. Inscriptions carved by travelers at desert rest stops, recording their passage and giving thanks for safe arrival. Archaeological remains of caravan camps showing where people stopped, what they ate, how they organized temporary settlements. Later written accounts describing routes that had been used for millennia. Caravans often traveled in groups for safety and efficiency. Multiple merchants, multiple guards, shared guides and resources. These created mobile communities, people who lived together for weeks or months, crossing deserts, developing relationships and hierarchies, sharing dangers and successes. The caravans brought wealth from distant lands. But there were those who worked through the night, creating wealth from ancient Egypt's most abundant resource, its dead. Not through embalming bodies, but through stealing from them. They had marriage contracts that specified, if he divorces her, she keeps the house and half his property. 3,000 years before modern divorce law. Egyptian marriage wasn't a religious sacrament. It was a contractual arrangement, often formalized through legal documents that spelled out exactly what each party owned, what they brought to the marriage, and what happened if the relationship ended. Women retained rights to their own property throughout the marriage. They could initiate divorce. They had legal protections that would seem progressive even by modern standards. A typical marriage contract might specify, the wife brings household goods and a sum of silver. The husband provides a house and financial support. If he divorces her without cause, she keeps her property plus a percentage of marital assets. If she initiates divorce, she receives less but still retains her original property. The details were negotiated, documented, witnessed. What marriage meant for nightlife varied by wealth. Most couples shared sleeping spaces out of necessity. Housing was limited. Rooms were multi-purpose. Wealthier households had separate sleeping quarters for husbands and wives, though couples still spent nights together. The sleeping arrangements reflected both practical realities and social expectations about intimacy and privacy. Evidence from letters and literature reveals what Egyptians valued in marriage. Companionship appears frequently the idea of a spouse as partner, not just economic arrangement or reproductive necessity. Children were desired and celebrated. Economic partnership mattered, with both spouses contributing to household wealth and management. The love poetry that survives is surprisingly passionate, explicit, and romantic. Declarations of desire, descriptions of physical beauty, longing expressed in language that feels immediate and human across millennia. My heart remembers well your love. The voice of the dove speaks out, saying, "Day breaks, which way are you going?" These weren't just formal literary exercises, they reflected genuine emotional experience. But literary ideals and lived reality diverged. Legal documents reveal messier truths. Divorce petitions accusing spouses of cruelty, infidelity, or failure to fulfill obligations. Property disputes where marriages dissolved into bitter conflicts over who owned what. Inheritance battles between children from different wives or different relationships. Polygamy was legal but rare, except among elites who could afford multiple households. Pharaohs had many wives. Wealthy nobles might have 2 or 3. For most Egyptians, marriage was monogamous, because economics demanded it. When polygamy occurred, it created complex household dynamics, multiple wives competing for resources and status, children from different mothers navigating inheritance hierarchies, jealousies and alliances that shaped family politics. Egyptian ideas about love, marriage, and intimacy resist simple characterization. They had sophisticated legal frameworks protecting both partners. They valued romantic love. They also navigated the practical realities of economic partnership, social expectations, and human imperfection. Marriage contracts protected property, but contracts couldn't protect hearts. And in the darkness, away from social scrutiny, hearts made choices that daylight would condemn. The poetry describes lovers meeting under sycamore trees, in moonlight, listening for sounds of approach. The sycamores they described are still there. We found them. Egyptian love poetry contains numerous references to secret meetings in gardens at night, creating a literary landscape where romance and darkness intertwine. These weren't vague, metaphorical settings, they were specific places where specific things happened. One poem reads, "My heart remembers well your love. One half of my temple is combed, the other left for you to arrange when you arrive." Another. The voice of the dove speaks out. It says, "Day breaks, which way are you going?" "Enough, little bird, must you so scold me?" The dove represents dawn approaching, the lovers reluctant to separate, aware that daylight means return to social visibility and propriety. The poems describe meeting under trees, by water, in garden pavilions. The sycamore, it speaks, "Come, spend the day in happiness." Trees feature prominently sycamores, date palms, Persea trees, each with symbolic associations, but also representing actual locations where lovers could meet shielded from observation. What these poems reveal goes beyond literary convention. Egyptians valued romantic love. They experienced longing, passion, the physical and emotional dimensions of desire. They engaged in courtship practices that involved private meetings away from family supervision and social scrutiny. Gardens were culturally significant spaces in ways that made them natural settings for romance. Wealthy estates had elaborate gardens with pools, flowering plants, fruit trees, shade structures. Gardens represented fertility, growth, sensuality, all the things associated with love and desire. But they also served practical purposes. In a society where most people lived in close quarters with minimal privacy, gardens provided rare spaces for private conversation and intimate encounters. The archaeological reality supports the poetry. Excavations reveal garden layouts from wealthy estates. Wall paintings show garden scenes with remarkable detail, trees arranged in rows, pools with fish and lotus flowers, people sitting in shade. Botanical evidence tells us what was grown: dates, figs, pomegranates, flowers for perfume and decoration. The poetry describes lovers listening for sounds of approach, aware that discovery would mean scandal. This reflects social reality. Night meetings in gardens weren't sanctioned courtship, they were transgressive, exciting partly because they violated expectations about proper behavior. Some poems come from perspectives of unmarried lovers, suggesting courtship practices that allowed young people some opportunity for romantic connection before marriage. Others suggest extramarital relationships, the garden serving as meeting place for affairs that had to remain hidden. The continuity of human emotion across 3 millennia is striking. The anxiety about being discovered, the reluctance to separate at dawn, the physical longing expressed in direct, sensual language. These feelings haven't changed. The circumstances that shaped how Egyptians experienced and expressed them were different, but the underlying emotions remain recognizable. Poetry described love as beautiful and pure. But not all night meetings in gardens were about love. Some were about lust, deception, and betrayal, and those left different kinds of records. Legal document 27 describes a husband who discovered his wife with another man. The document ends, "Both their bodies were given to crocodiles." The court ruled this was justified. Adultery was condemned socially and punishable legally, but the enforcement and consequences varied dramatically based on gender, social status, and specific circumstances. The legal papyri that survive reveal a spectrum from harsh punishment to relative tolerance, with women almost always facing more severe consequences than men. A case from the New Kingdom documents a woman accused of adultery by her husband. He presented witnesses who claimed to have seen her with another man. She denied the accusation but couldn't produce counter-witnesses. The court granted divorce, awarded her husband the majority of marital property, and barred her from custody of their children. She faced social ostracism that made remarriage unlikely. Another case involves a man accused of relationship with a married woman. The husband brought the accusation, provided testimony from neighbors. The accused man was beaten publicly 20 lashes and fined an amount equivalent to several months of average wages. Harsh, but survivable. His reputation suffered, but he wasn't destroyed socially or economically. The gender double standard was explicit and unapologetic. A wife's adultery was viewed as theft of her husband's exclusive sexual access, and as contamination of his bloodline. Any children she bore might not be his. A husband's adultery was wrong but didn't carry the same level of social or legal condemnation. Men faced consequences primarily if they committed adultery with another man's wife, violating that man's rights rather than violating marriage itself. Some husbands took matters into their own hands. The case of the crocodiles wasn't unique. Legal records document men who killed wives or lovers caught in adultery, and courts often ruled such killings justified. Not always, some husbands were prosecuted for murder, but frequently enough that wronged husbands knew they had a reasonable chance of legal protection if they acted immediately upon discovery. Proving adultery was difficult. It required witnesses who saw the act or confession extracted through interrogation. Suspicion wasn't enough legally, but socially, it could be devastating. Some divorce petitions include lurid accusations, detailed descriptions of alleged affairs, times and places, descriptions of how the adultery was discovered. These may have been exaggerated to justify divorce and secure favorable property settlements, weaponizing adultery claims even when proof was absent. The consequences extended beyond the immediate parties. Children born from adulterous relationships might not be recognized as legitimate, affecting their inheritance rights and social status. Families were destroyed not just by divorce, but by the shame and disruption that followed exposure. Entire social networks could fracture along lines of loyalty to one party or the other. But attitudes varied. Some literature treats adultery humorously, stories of clever wives deceiving foolish husbands, of lovers escaping through windows, of situations resolved without tragedy. This suggests that despite official condemnation and legal penalties, people's actual attitudes were more complex and varied. Adultery was about desire and opportunity. But there were other betrayals that happened at night. Betrayals not of marriage vows, but of loyalty to rulers, to positions, to the very order of society. And these betrayals were punished far more severely than any personal infidelity. They confessed to robbing the tomb of a pharaoh. Under torture, they described burning the mummy to extract the gold. The transcript is casual, almost bored. They'd done this dozens of times. The Theban tomb robbery investigations during the 20th dynasty produced trial records that survive in remarkable detail. These documents reveal that tomb robbery wasn't desperate opportunism. It was organized crime involving careful planning, inside knowledge, specialized skills, and networks for disposing of stolen goods. One documented case involved a group that included priests who knew tomb locations, guards who could be bribed or who actively participated, and metal workers who could process stolen gold and silver. They operated systematically, targeting multiple royal tombs over months or years. The planning was meticulous. They needed tools to break through sealed doors. They needed to navigate tomb complexes in darkness, using minimal light to avoid detection. They needed knowledge of which tombs held the most valuable goods. The robberies occurred at night, for obvious reasons. Darkness provided cover. Fewer people were active who might notice suspicious activity near the necropolis. The night shifts of tomb guardians could be bribed or threatened into looking the other way. What they did inside the tombs was sacrilege by Egyptian standards. They stripped gold leaf from coffins. They removed jewelry from mummies. In some cases, they burned the mummies themselves to extract gold that had been melted onto the wrappings or to access amulets placed within the wrapping layers. The trial transcripts describe this matter of factly participants confessing under torture, naming accomplices, describing what they took and where they sold it. The punishments for tomb robbery were severe when enforced. Impalement on stakes, burning alive, mutilation followed by execution. The legal texts specify these penalties to deter would-be robbers. But the deterrence failed consistently across Egyptian history. The scale of tomb robbery was enormous. Most ancient Egyptian tombs that archaeologists have found were already robbed in antiquity, often within years or decades of burial. Some royal tombs show evidence of multiple robberies at different times. The tomb of Tutankhamun is famous, partly because it was one of the few found largely intact, and even it had been entered twice by ancient robbers who took smaller, valuable items before it was resealed. This wasn't just criminal activity by desperate poor people. The trial records reveal participation across social classes. Laborers who did the physical work of breaking in. Merchants who fenced stolen goods. Officials who provided information about which tombs were worth robbing. Priests who knew layouts and security measures. Guards who were supposed to prevent robbery but instead facilitated it. The corruption was systemic. Tomb robbery couldn't have operated at this scale without widespread complicity. People at every level of Egyptian society participated or turned blind eyes. Tomb robbers betrayed the dead for gold. But there was one final category of night betrayers, those who betrayed the trust of the sick and desperate, those who claimed to heal but sometimes killed. He claimed the powder would cure her fever. It did stop the fever, permanently. His trial revealed he'd sold the same cure to 14 other families. Ancient Egypt had official physicians, men trained in temple medical schools, employed by the state, whose treatments followed documented procedures. But most people couldn't access official medicine. It was expensive, restricted to cities and wealthy patrons, unavailable to common Egyptians who got sick or injured. This created space for unofficial practitioners, healers who used traditional plant remedies, magicians who combined practical treatment with ritual, herbalists who understood local medicines. Some were skilled and genuinely helpful, preserving knowledge passed through families, treating people who had no other options. Others were charlatans. They sold fake amulets claiming protective or curative powers. They provided ineffective treatments for serious conditions, taking payment from desperate people while offering nothing of value. They promised cures for incurable diseases, exploiting hope and fear. Night created opportunities for the unscrupulous. Some treatments were administered after dark, partly for privacy, partly because certain rituals or substances were believed more effective at night. This reduced oversight made it harder for families to observe what practitioners actually did, created situations where patients were vulnerable and isolated. The darkest cases involved poison presented as medicine. Legal papyri document trials where healers were accused of killing patients deliberately. Some were hired by enemies of the victim, paid to administer poison disguised as treatment. Others apparently killed through incompetence or indifference, providing substances that were toxic rather than therapeutic. One documented case describes a healer who sold a powder claimed to reduce fever. It did reduce fever by killing the patients who took it. His trial revealed 14 families who'd purchased the treatment. How many more cases went undetected, attributed to illness rather than murder? Most practitioners probably meant well, but lack of regulation and limited medical knowledge created dangers even from good intentions. Betrayers worked in darkness because darkness hid their crimes. But there were things darkness couldn't hide from. Things ancient Egyptians believed hunted at night, preying on the vulnerable, the wicked, and sometimes the merely unlucky. Our demons had job descriptions. The demon of the 4th hour caused nightmares. The demon of the 11th hour stopped hearts. They took their work seriously. Ancient Egyptians believed the 12 hours of night weren't just measurements of time. They were territories, each ruled by specific demons with names, characteristics, and zones of influence. This wasn't vague folklore, it was structured cosmology, documented in funerary texts like the Book of Gates and the Book of Caverns. These texts describe the 12 hours as 12 regions of the underworld that Ra's solar barque traveled through during its nightly journey. Each region had its own geography, its own guardian demons, its own specific dangers. The 1st hour was relatively safe. The 7th hour contained the lake of fire. The 11th hour held the most dangerous demons, those who could stop a heart mid-beat or trap a soul in eternal darkness. The demons had names and descriptions that survived in texts and on tomb walls. Apophis, the chaos serpent, appeared in multiple hours as the primary threat to Ra and to cosmic order itself. Face behind walked backwards, attacking from directions you weren't watching. The Davurus consumed the hearts of the unjustified dead, those who failed the weighing of the heart in judgment. These weren't just theological concepts. They affected how people actually behaved. Certain hours were considered more dangerous than others for specific activities. Travel during the 11th hour was avoided when possible. Business that could wait until morning was delayed rather than conducted during the deepest night hours. Protective rituals varied based on what time it was. Different demons required different defenses. Evidence from magical papyri shows spells designed to ward off specific hour demons. The spells name the demon, describe its nature, and provide formulas believed to offer protection. People didn't just know about these demons abstractly, they carried amulets with demon names inscribed on them. Egyptian magical theory held that knowing a demon's true name gave you power over it, the ability to command or banish it. The psychological reality of experiencing nighttime hours in ancient Egypt created perfect conditions for these beliefs to feel absolutely real. Without accurate timekeeping, hours passed slowly and unmeasured. Darkness was complete, except for weak lamplight. Most people were alone or with minimal company. The temperature was cold. Sounds carried strangely through the desert air, creating auditory illusions. In these conditions, fear and imagination could generate genuine experiences of dread, of presence, of being watched by something malevolent. Whether our demons existed objectively or were psychological phenomena interpreted through cultural belief systems, the terror people felt was real. The precautions they took were rational responses to what they genuinely believed threatened them. Our demons were cosmic threats, part of the universal order, but there were other night terrors that were personal, targeting specific people for specific reasons. And these, they believed, were created by human malice. They found the wax figure buried under her doorway. It had 13 pins stuck through it. Her name was written on it in her husband's handwriting. Malicious magic was real to ancient Egyptians. Not metaphorically real, not psychologically real, actually real. Curses could sicken enemies, destroy reputations, cause impotence, create discord in marriages, bring financial ruin. And night was when such magic had its greatest power, when the barriers between the physical and spiritual worlds thinned enough for human will to reshape reality. The magical papyri that survive contain curse formulas with disturbing specificity. Instructions for making an enemy sick, create a wax figure in their likeness, inscribe their name on it, Recite this exact incantation while piercing it with bronze needles. Bury it in a cemetery facing west. Instructions for destroying a rival's reputation. Write their name on papyrus with red ink. Burn it at midnight while reciting formulas that invoke demons to speak against them. The materials required were specific: wax or clay, for creating figures that represented the victim. The figures were sometimes remarkably detailed, shaped to resemble the target, dressed in miniature clothing. Written spells were inserted into the figures or wrapped around them, papyrus inscribed with curses in hieratic script. If possible, practitioners obtained materials from the victim: hair, nail clippings, pieces of clothing, anything that had been in contact with their body. These materials created stronger magical connections. The rituals often involved burying the cursed figures. Graveyards were preferred locations because they connected the curse to death and to the spirits of the dead who might be enlisted to enforce it. Crossroads were also used: liminal spaces between destinations, between choices, where magical working was believed particularly effective. Some curses required burning the figures while reciting formulas, the smoke carrying the malice upward to demons who would implement the curse. People lived in genuine fear of being cursed. They took protective measures seriously: amulets inscribed with counter-curse formulas, spells recited daily to deflect magical attacks, divination to identify whether unexplained misfortune was natural or magically caused, and if magical, who had cursed them. The archaeological evidence is concrete. Curse tablets found buried near temples and homes, thin sheets of lead inscribed with curses, sometimes naming specific targets, sometimes seeking general harm to enemies. Legal papyri document cases where people accused others of cursing them, bringing evidence of suspicious behavior, requesting investigation and punishment. One documented case describes a woman who became inexplicably ill. Her family suspected curse and searched her house. They found a wax figure buried under her doorway, pierced with 13 bronze pins, her name inscribed on it. The handwriting was identified as her husband's. He was prosecuted, confessed under interrogation, claimed he acted because she'd committed adultery. Both were punished, he for malicious magic, she for the adultery he'd accused her of. Practicing malicious magic was illegal and punishable, sometimes by death, but prosecution was difficult. Proving someone had performed a curse required finding physical evidence, the wax figures, the written spells, or obtaining confession. Most curse practitioners worked carefully, hiding evidence, operating in darkness where observation was difficult. Curses were human evil, channeling supernatural power. But there were night threats that weren't human at all, entities ancient Egyptians believed existed independent of human magic, hunting through darkness for victims. The protective spell for infants lists 27 demons by name and describes exactly what each one does to sleeping babies. The descriptions are specific, too specific. Ancient Egyptians had a complex demonology that catalogued malevolent entities the way modern science catalogues species. These weren't vague folklore monsters. They had names, characteristics, behaviors, and specific victims they preferred. And night was when they hunted. The restless dead were particularly feared. Spirits of people who died violently murdered, killed in accidents, dying in childbirth were believed unable to pass properly into the afterlife. They remained trapped between worlds, angry, confused, dangerous. Those who died without proper burial rituals became wandering spirits who haunted locations and attacked the living out of rage at their incomplete transformation. Medical texts describe ailments attributed to these spirits. A persistent cough that wouldn't respond to treatment, caused by a restless spirit trying to possess the victim's body. Sudden weakness or paralysis. A dead spirit draining the victim's life force. Unexplained pain that moved through the body. A spirit attacking from inside, consuming the car gradually. The treatments combined practical medicine with magical intervention, herbal remedies to address symptoms, incantations to identify which spirit was causing the problem, offerings to appease the spirit and convince it to leave, protective spells to drive it away permanently. The Aku were particularly dangerous spirits of the dead who maintained some power and intelligence, who could be reasoned with through offerings, but could also inflict severe harm if angered or if they targeted someone for unknown reasons. Letters to the dead survive, written by the living and placed in tombs, asking deceased relatives to stop causing problems or to intervene against other malevolent spirits. Protection against these night predators was layered and extensive. Household gods like Bez, depicted as a grotesque dwarf with a protruding tongue, and Taret, shown as a pregnant hippopotamus, standing upright, appeared on furniture, walls, household items. Their images were believed to ward off demons and spirits, creating zones of protection around homes and especially around sleeping areas. Doorways received special attention, magical texts inscribed on door frames, amulets hung above entrances, specific words spoken when crossing thresholds, especially at night. These weren't decorative choices, they were defensive architecture against supernatural intrusion. Children were considered extraordinarily vulnerable, infants particularly. The protective spells designed for babies listed demons by name, 27 specific entities, each with documented methods of attack. Some caused sudden infant death. Others produced illness, fever, seizures. The spells described what each demon did in disturbing detail, then provided formulas to prevent the attacks. These beliefs served psychological and sociological functions beyond simple superstition. Infant mortality was tragically common. Disease killed without warning or explanation. Misfortune struck randomly. The supernatural framework gave people ways to understand these tragedies, to feel some control through protective measures, to take concrete action rather than accept helpless suffering. Demons and spirits were supernatural threats. But there was one night predator that was all too real, all too physical, and far more common than any ghost: disease. They knew fever struck at night, that people died in darkness before dawn. What they didn't know was why. So they blamed demons and performed exorcisms that sometimes, inexplicably, worked. Epidemic disease was attributed to divine wrath, particularly the anger of Sekhmet, goddess who held dominion over both plague and healing. She was depicted as a lioness or lion-headed woman, fierce and terrifying, capable of unleashing pestilence that could devastate cities or of withdrawing it if properly appeased. Evidence of actual disease outbreaks survives in multiple forms. Skeletal remains show patterns consistent with epidemic illness, multiple deaths in short periods, similar pathologies across different individuals, demographic patterns showing vulnerability of certain age groups. Texts reference times of pestilence, describing symptoms and social disruption. Medical papyri document treatments for epidemic diseases, attempting to categorize symptoms and responses. Egyptians observed that disease was more dangerous at night. Fever spiked after sunset. Delirium occurred during dark hours. People died most frequently in the time between midnight and dawn. These patterns were real medical science, now understands circadian rhythms affect immune function and body temperature regulation, but Egyptians interpreted them through supernatural frameworks. Night weakened the body's defenses, because night weakened all barriers between worlds. Responses to epidemic combined practical measures with religious intervention. Quarantine was practiced, isolating the sick from the healthy, restricting movement into and out of affected areas. Buildings were fumigated with smoke from specific herbs and incenses, believed to purify spaces and drive out disease-causing spirits. Medical treatments addressed symptoms using herbal remedies, some of which had genuine therapeutic effects. During severe epidemics, special nighttime processions honored Sekhmet, attempting to appease her wrath and convince her to withdraw the plague. Priests carried her statue through darkened streets, making offerings, reciting prayers, performing rituals designed to satisfy divine anger. Social disruption during epidemics was severe. Normal activities ceased. Markets closed. Construction halted. People avoided contact even with neighbors and relatives. Fear spread as rapidly as illness, creating paralysis that compounded the death toll. Some Egyptian medical understanding was surprisingly accurate. They associated malaria with marshes and stagnant water, recognizing environmental connections even without understanding disease vectors. They treated infections with substances that modern analysis shows had antimicrobial properties: honey, certain plant extracts, minerals. Quarantine practices demonstrated practical understanding of contagion. But the limitations were significant. Egyptian medicine was sophisticated for its time but couldn't cure many conditions. Bacterial infections, viral diseases, parasitic illnesses, treatments might ease symptoms but rarely eliminated the underlying cause. Supernatural explanations filled the gaps between observation and understanding. Disease could be fought with medicine, with magic, with prayer. But there was one night terror for which there was no cure, no protection, no escape. The terror that waited for everyone, that would come eventually no matter what defenses were raised: death itself. They wrote letters to their dead parents asking them to stop causing nightmares. Some of those letters contain apologies, some contain threats. The very recently dead were considered the most dangerous. Spirits freshly separated from bodies, not yet settled in the afterlife, confused and distressed by their new state. The period between death and proper burial was when spirits were most likely to harm the living, either deliberately out of anger or accidentally through their confusion. Bodies awaiting burial required constant watching, not just to prevent desecration but to contain the spirit, to keep it from wandering and causing problems. Households where someone had died received nighttime protections, amulets, prayers, vigilant relatives who stayed awake monitoring for signs of spiritual disturbance. Letters to the dead survive, written by living relatives and placed in tombs. Some ask deceased parents or spouses to stop causing illness or nightmares in surviving family members. Please, mother, cease troubling your daughter. She has made offerings as required. Others are less polite, threatening to stop offerings if the harassment continues. But not all ancestral spirits were harmful. Some were protective, watching over descendants, intervening when danger threatened. The relationship was complex, reverence mixed with fear, love combined with caution. Death waited for everyone. But first, every single night came the dawn. They believed if they missed the morning ritual, the sun might not rise. For 3,000 years, they never missed it. Not once. The hour before dawn was the most sacred time in the Egyptian religious calendar. Every day, without exception. In temples across Egypt, priests rose in darkness to perform rituals that they genuinely believed sustained the cosmic order and ensured morning would arrive. The sequence began while stars still dominated the sky. Priests purified themselves in sacred pools, the cold water shocking them fully awake. They dressed in clean linen, white and ritually pure. They entered temple sanctuaries that had been sealed since sunset, unlocking doors with specific prayers, moving through progressively more sacred spaces until they reached the innermost chamber where the god's statue resided. The statue had been sleeping. Not metaphorically, Egyptians believed the god's Ka inhabited the statue, and like all living things, it required sleep. The priests awakened it as you would wake a living being, with gentle words and gradual exposure to light. Purification came next. The statue was washed with water from sacred sources. It was anointed with oils. The linen wrappings from the previous day were removed and replaced with fresh cloth. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were the actual care required by a divine being who had physical needs despite existing beyond normal reality. Offerings followed precise patterns documented in ritual texts. Bread arranged in specific quantities, beer in particular vessels, incense burned at exact distances from the statue's face. Each offering accompanied by formulas that invited the god to consume its spiritual essence. The hymns were timed to coincide with the first light. Priests watched the eastern horizon through temple windows or from rooftops, calculating the moment when Ra's Barke would emerge from the underworld. As the first rays touched the sky, they recited texts that welcomed Ra, that celebrated his victory over Apophis, that acknowledged the return of light and order and life. This happened simultaneously across Egypt. Temples in Memphis, Thebes, Heliopolis, Abydos, priests in hundreds of locations performing the same rituals at the same moment, creating a coordinated network of ceremonial support for the sun god's daily resurrection. They believed this network was necessary, that Ra needed their help. That without these rituals, performed correctly and continuously, the cosmic battle might be lost and morning might never come. The ritual texts that survive are remarkably detailed. Exact hymns with every word specified, descriptions of movements and gestures, requirements for purification that had to be met before priests could even enter certain spaces. The precision suggests the stakes getting it wrong meant risking everything. These morning rituals were maintained for over 3,000 years, dynasty after dynasty, political upheaval after upheaval, invasion after invasion. The dawn rituals continued. Priests rose before sunrise every single day, performed the complex ceremonies, took responsibility for ensuring the sun would rise. The psychological weight must have been enormous. Every priest who participated knew that, if he failed, if the rituals were incomplete or incorrect, the consequences were cosmic. While priests performed their rituals inside sealed temples, outside, in the streets and houses, ordinary Egyptians performed their own morning routines. And these too had sacred dimensions, reflecting the belief that every dawn was a personal resurrection. The first action of every Egyptian morning was washing, not for hygiene, for purification, because you had spent the night in a state resembling death, and you needed to be ritually alive again. Waking was resurrection in miniature. The car that had wandered during sleep, that had separated partially from the body and travelled to other realms, returned fully. Consciousness emerged from the death-like state of sleep. You opened your eyes to light after hours of darkness. You moved from vulnerability to agency. The washing that followed wasn't casual. Water was poured over hands, face, sometimes the entire body. Prayers accompanied the washing, simple formulas, thanking gods for another day, asking for protection through the hours ahead, acknowledging survival through another night. These weren't elaborate temple ceremonies, but personal practices, quiet rituals performed in household courtyards or near water sources. Dressing came next. Clean linen if you could afford it. The clothing from yesterday if you couldn't. Amulets worn during sleep were checked, adjusted, sometimes replaced with different ones suited for daytime protection. The first meal of the day carried symbolic weight. Bread, the staple of Egyptian life. Beer, safer than water and consumed by everyone. Sometimes fruit dates or figs. Sometimes vegetables if they were available. Eating proved you had survived. Your body needed nourishment because it was alive, functioning, no longer in the liminal state between existence and dissolution. The sounds of dawn were specific and sequential. Roosters announced the approaching light before it became visible. Other birds joined ibises near the Nile, desert birds in outlying areas. The quality of silence changed as night creatures became quiet and day creatures stirred. Light transformed everything gradually. First the sky lightened, stars fading, then the eastern horizon glowed. Finally the sun emerged, and within minutes the entire landscape shifted from darkness to illumination. Colors returned, details became visible. The world reassembled itself from shadow into substance. Smoke rose from cooking fires as families prepared morning meals. People emerged from doorways, first a few, then more, then the streets filled with activity. The night workers ended their shifts. Bakers delivered the last bread from ovens that would soon cool. Embalmers left their per-nefer buildings, ritually impure from handling the dead, heading home to sleep through the day. Guards completed their watch and were replaced by day patrols. Markets opened. Merchants set up displays. The noise level increased, voices calling, animals being moved, commerce beginning. The city transformed from the quiet, dangerous place it had been during darkness into the familiar daytime environment where normal life occurred. Most people experienced relief at dawn. The anxieties that accompanied darkness, fear of demons, of criminals, of the cosmic battle that determined whether morning would come, dissolved with the returning light. Another night survived, another day granted. But not everyone welcomed dawn. Those who had been engaged in forbidden activities during darkness now faced exposure. Those dreading difficult tasks or painful responsibilities wished for continued night. Those in grief or illness found no comfort in the return of light that would only illuminate their suffering more clearly. Dawn brought the return of normal life, normal activity, normal visibility. But it also revealed what had happened during the darkness. And some mornings, What was revealed changed everything. Some mornings, the Nile brought gifts upstream, timber, pottery, sometimes bodies. Every dawn, guards walked the riverbank, checking what the darkness had delivered. Dawn was the moment of revelation. What had been hidden by darkness became visible with light, and some of what became visible changed everything. Theft discovered when merchants opened shops to find goods missing, doors broken, evidence of nighttime intrusion. Bodies found in streets or alleys, murder victims, people who died from illness during the night, suicides who chose darkness for their final act. Fires that had burned through the night, leaving structures damaged or destroyed. Missing persons who never returned home, their families waiting through darkness, hoping for arrival that never came. The social response was immediate and organized. Neighbors gathered at scenes of discovery. Officials were summoned. Witnesses questioned about what they'd seen or heard during the night. Attempts made to reconstruct events from evidence footprints, displaced objects, signs of struggle or forced entry. Some mysteries remained unsolved. Disappearances with no witnesses, no evidence, no explanation. Deaths with circumstances that suggested violence but no clear perpetrator. Events that contradicted what should have been possible: locked rooms found open, sealed containers emptied, people found in places they couldn't have reached. Legal documents preserve morning discoveries that triggered investigations. A tomb in the Valley of the Kings found broken into, the seal shattered, guards reporting they'd heard nothing during the night. A royal storehouse discovered robbed of grain, the theft systematic and clearly planned. An official found dead in his residence, the circumstances suggesting assassination but the evidence ambiguous. Not all dawn revelations were disasters. Births that occurred during the night brought joy. Travelers arriving safely after dangerous journeys. Messages bringing news of military victories or favorable trade agreements. But the unpredictability created tension. Every dawn carried potential for revelation, for discovery that would disrupt normal life or confirm worst fears. 3,000 years have passed since the nights we've described. The people who stayed awake, priests, guards, bakers, conspirators, lovers, tomb robbers, are all long dead. But the questions remain. Why does their nightlife still fascinate us? What does it reveal about them and about us? We can reconstruct what they did at night. We can read their spells and charts and letters. But we can't know what they felt when the lamps went out. And that's what makes them human, just like us. Ancient Egyptian nightlife reveals a civilization of remarkable sophistication. They blended scientific, astronomical observation with spiritual cosmology. They organized complex labor systems that operated in darkness. They created legal frameworks and social networks. They experienced love, betrayal, fear, courage, the full spectrum of human emotion and behavior. Their influence survived them. The Egyptian hour system shaped how later civilizations divided time. Their astronomical observations contributed to scientific knowledge that accumulated across millennia. Their beliefs about death and the afterlife influenced religions that came after them. Modern excavations continue discovering evidence. Letters describing nighttime activities, astronomical documents recording celestial observations, tomb inscriptions detailing rituals we didn't know existed. But much remains unknowable. The subjective experiences of individuals, the conversations whispered in gardens, the dreams that were never recorded, the secrets that died with those who kept them. What studying Egyptian nights reveals is universal. Fear of darkness exists across all human cultures. So does courage in facing it, the need for connection, the awareness of mortality, the search for meaning in the space between sunset and dawn. They lived 3,000 years ago. But when night falls, we understand them perfectly.